Chapter 33. David Kaplan's health improved so rapidly that Lisa's visit to Kingsbrook Rehabilitation Institute that Tuesday was the last visit from anyone. Lisa was shocked and surprised to see her father walking full stride down the hall, wearing his black jacket and pants, and with his favorite black yarmulke fixed firmly on his held-high head. He walked even faster as he approached her and gave her a firm, enthusiastic hug. "Lisa, my beautiful youngest daughter, see what the Eternal has done for me." He released her and spun around like a handsome model on a runway. Lisa was still recovering from her initial shock. "Look at you, Daddy. You're all better. Whatever the therapy was, it certainly worked. What did they do?" "I don't know. Naomi said maybe it was just the Mishaberach prayer. You know, Lisa, our God hears that prayer. I prayed it. She prayed it. Maybe you prayed it?" "Okay, Daddy, whatever it was, I hope you just stay well. Between that stroke and the other one, you've had us all worried to death." "So how are Mark and the children?" "They're fine." "That's good. I'd like them to come see me, and I want to give Noah and Lindsay a big hug. I haven't seen them in so long. They must have grown so much, I won't recognize them." "You will, Daddy. They won't recognize you. The last time they saw you, you were very, very sick. I'll try to bring them by tomorrow. They'll be so excited to see you." Lisa's plan, like the plans of so many families, didn't end up coming to pass. By the next day, David Kaplan was being wheeled into the elevator in a wheelchair he didn't need to be sitting on by his oldest daughter, who had taken off work from the Macy's housewares department to take him home. She had ordered a cab, a luxury for Naomi, from the Rehabilitation Institute to their house, but in this case, it was a wise investment. When they got to the facility's entrance, David Kaplan arose from the wheelchair and entered the waiting cab. Naomi put his few belongings in the taxi, and they drove off. That morning, she had cleaned and straightened the house. Now, she was about to welcome her beloved Abba back to the home they shared together. When they arrived at the house, her father got out of the cab and stood facing the door he had entered and exited so often. He inhaled the sweet summer afternoon Brooklyn air. "Home, my own Beis Hamikdash, my temple, my personal house of prayer, my holy dwelling, with you, my daughter. Let's go in, Abba. I'll make you your favorite tea. Then you can go and rest. I've rested enough. We'll sit and talk about the sages, even on a Tuesday." "Okay, Abba, I've missed that so much." They entered the house. David proceeded to slowly walk through every room, downstairs and upstairs, as if he was inspecting it for purchase, while Naomi boiled the tea and put a few of his favorite Parv cookies, ones that could be eaten with milk or meat, on a small plate. When he finally came down the stairs from marveling at his own bed, on which Naomi had placed fresh, brand-new Macy sheets, she waved him over to the kitchen table. His tea was ready to drink, and a small book sat on the table. "Abba, I would like you to read the Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers, to me, like you used to on Shabbat." He pulled the book over to himself and began to leaf through it. All at once, Naomi began to feel the old, safe, and precious opportunity to ask the wisest Jew in the world anything she wanted. She thought she would never have that opportunity again, and yet here it was. Whenever she had a concern in the old days, before his first stroke, he always said to her, "Well, my daughter, I see you have something on your heart. You may share it, whatever it is." At those times, she asked her deepest questions, and he always answered wisely and with no judgment. If he was looking into her eyes now and not down at the book, he might say the same thing, and if he did, the question wasn't whether she would be safe. The question was whether he would be safe. He seemed well enough sitting there leafing through the slender volume. There were no stroke symptoms whatsoever. He was obviously getting stronger every day since the miracle, if that's what it was. But would he be able to answer the question that would most test his stable blood pressure? Naomi didn't know for sure, but she had to ask. There was nowhere else she could go, and no one else she could turn to. "Abba, he looked up from the book. "I see you have something on your—" "Yes, Abba, I do. Whatever it is." "Well, here goes." "Right. Whatever, Abba. What if Jesus, I'm sorry to use that name in this house so soon after you've come home, but what if Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah? God forbid. David Kaplan tried to control his newly restored face muscles and to keep his eyes from widening in surprise. He knew he had to remain as calm as possible so Naomi's heart would remain open. He breathed in and out as slowly as he could to maintain his heart's resting state. Then, barely above a whisper, he asked his own question. Is there peace in the world, my dear daughter? After all, that is the sign of the Messiah's coming. Well, no, there isn't, Abba. You're right. I forgot that. He nodded, but she wasn't quite finished. No, there isn't, except in Darren Brock's heart, I think. She braced herself for his response. After all, the first stroke had been the primary reason she broke up with Darren. Meanwhile, he tried to keep his tone at an even keel. I see. So he's trying to convince you of this possibility? Oh, no, Abba. I haven't had one real conversation with him in months. I broke up with him, you know. I believe I told you that while you were recovering from your first stroke. Yes, I remember. And he also told me you did that. Mensch that he is. So, Naomi, what is all this? You know what we believe. Why are you asking such a question? Not that any question is off limits, but why? Well, I didn't tell you everything on Sunday after you woke up. I didn't tell you that Abrahet loves you very much, and yes, I'm sure she does. I love her too, and, well, Abba, your tea is getting cold. She pointed toward the cookies. And see, I put out your favorite par of cookies. Please take one. I will, in God's time. And the tea can also wait. Please, go on. Well, I told her, after all, she was crying over your condition, and you always say to respect the faith of others, so, Abba, you should drink the tea before it becomes iced tea. So, isn't it summer? Naomi, if you're trying to make me nervous, it's working. I'm sorry, Abba. So, I told her she could pray for you any way she wanted, even her way. So that's it. So she prayed her way, so... Well, remember when I told you I prayed the Mishaberach prayer? Yes, of course, Naomi. I remember. And of course, I wouldn't expect Abraham to pray that prayer unless perhaps she'd learned it in Ethiopia. But even then, right, she didn't pray that prayer. As a matter of fact, she just said one word, and right away you woke up, all better. I take it that word was Jesus? No, Abba, it wasn't. David tried to conceal his relief. All right, then. What was it? Well, it was Yeshua, his name in that Jewish version of the New Testament. Okay, there's a very reasonable explanation, my bright and inquisitive daughter. The word Yeshua means salvation. She obviously was asking for God to save my life, just as we cry out during Sukkot in the fall, and he did. That's the answer. The Sukkot David Kaplan was referring to is the Feast of Tabernacles, a biblical fall feast. And the Sukkot prayer that David Kaplan mentioned originated in Isaiah 12. Therefore, with joy will you draw water from the wells of salvation. Yeshua in Hebrew. David could tell that Naomi wasn't fully satisfied with that answer, which happened to be the same one she had been telling herself since the miracle. In her face, particularly in her eyes, he could see a restless dissatisfaction with the salvation with the small s response. So he decided to call for some outside help, specifically from a well-known 20th century Jewish scholar. That scholar's name was Martin Buber. Martin Buber was born in Vienna in 1878 to Orthodox Jewish parents. As a young man, he moved to Zurich, Switzerland, to study philosophy. Eventually, he became an honorary professor at the University of Frankfurt, where he became close friends with the Jewish theologian Franz Rosenzweig, with whom he translated the Hebrew Bible into German. David had called on Rosenzweig for help the year before when Naomi first asked questions about Darren Brock's faith. Both Buber and Rosenzweig held much more liberal understandings of Judaism than David Kaplan, but they had important philosophical views in common with each other, views that might provide answers to Naomi's nagging questions. Buber's included his famous I and Thou book, which investigated the relationship between two beings, human with human and human with God. He received one of his several Nobel Prize nominations for that book. Buber ended up fleeing Germany in 1938 and moved to Jerusalem. He lived there until his death in 1965. In all of Martin Buber's vast body of literature, there was only one short enigmatic paragraph that David decided to share with his daughter. He wasn't sure he, or anyone for that matter, understood exactly what Buber was getting at, but he knew that others had quoted this short account to encourage Jews to stay within their own faith tradition, and that was good enough for him. Have I ever mentioned the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber? No, Daddy, I don't think you have. Naomi knew, even with that short introduction, that for the second time in all their discussions, her father was about to quote a modern scholar and not a traditional sage, the other time being Franz Rosenzweig. He continued by recommending Buber as a person worth quoting. Well, Martin Buber was just about the greatest Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. Maybe not Orthodox, but great nonetheless. I thought that Rosenzweig guy was, Abba. Well, yes, he also was. In fact, they were close friends in Germany before the Shoah, the Holocaust, and they both thought about a lot of things. A lot of things! David wasn't sure what all those things were, and he had never had much interest in finding out. But he did find one thing Buber said useful. So he was once asked a question, a very difficult question, very. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure what the question was, but I think it had to do with the attraction of other religions, for instance, Christianity. Naomi's face muscles twitched almost imperceptibly upon hearing that word out of her beloved father's mouth. He noticed her response, but didn't let on. Anyway, this is what he said. I believe I can more or less quote the great man. Are you ready? Yes, Abba, I'm ready. He began the almost verbatim quote. There is something that can only be found in one place. It's a great treasure, a great treasure, the fulfillment of our whole existence. The place where this treasure can be found is the place on which you stand, in your own backyard, so to speak. He pointed down at the kitchen table. Right here. Then he pointed toward the kitchen window, which faced their small backyard. Or there, to be exact. What does that mean, Abba? It means what it means. It's in your own backyard. That's where to look for your, Naomi got up and walked over to and behind his chair, putting her arms around his shoulders, holding onto him tightly. I see, Abba. I understand. I'm so glad to be here with you, in our own house, with our own backyard, and our own synagogue in walking distance. There'll never be any man in my life but you, Abba. Never. He put one of his hands on one of her arms and the other on her other arm. He considered encouraging her that there would someday be another man, a good Jewish husband, but he decided against it. It was enough for now that she understood what Martin Buber meant, or David Kaplan thought he meant, and that she seemed to be in agreement with it. Salvation was doing its job, David Kaplan's definition of salvation. Chapter 34. Darren Brock sat in his cubicle, swiveling in his cut-rate, squeaky gray cloth office chair. He stared at the upper halves of his fellow officers and the clerical staff that supported them as they passed by on the well-worn top rug just outside his flimsy barricade. That included Margaret, who winked at him as she walked by, which was far more expressive than the weak wave he gave her and Officer Mack outside the widow Chaya Mendel's home. But she tended to send signals whenever she passed him in the NYPD's Midtown South Precinct building, and why not? They were engaged, weren't they? As he leaned dangerously back in his chair, Darren tried to mentally prepare for the meeting that was about to take place in Inspector Ralph Lewis's office. He had been considering this meeting with Lewis and Homeland Security expert Lawrence Schmidt for approximately 2 weeks. He had called for the meeting without explaining the exact reason for it. He didn't want Lewis and Schmidt to come up with answers beforehand. Instead, he wanted to lay it all out before them and then let them respond. That way they couldn't write off his concerns, and he was concerned. His experienced detective sense told him something didn't make sense, and this time he wouldn't be talked out of his suspicions. He stared like a meditative Buddhist monk, toward the aisle facing the main office door. Within 2 minutes, Lawrence Schmidt appeared. What, is that ridiculously obvious gray suit and black tie glued to him, or what? What a career flunky. Darren didn't typically allow his thoughts to veer so negative. However, he hadn't been impressed by this HS guy the first time around, and he wasn't looking forward to seeing him again, especially along with Inspector Lewis. Yet he knew the meeting was necessary. He rose from his chair and left the cubicle just as Schmidt walked by. The two locked eyes and then hands. Schmidt's grasp was decidedly firmer. Darren greeted him, choosing an informal approach. "Welcome to the Midtown Manhattan South Precinct, Larry." "Oh, yeah, Brock. What's this about?" Darren stiffened. "You'll see. Just follow me to the inspector's office." It was only a few feet away. He knocked, and Lewis yelled from inside, "You're both late. Just come in." Darren pointed at Schmidt. "He's late." "Cut the crap." Schmidt took it upon himself to swing the door fully open, as if he worked there, and not Darren Brock. Lewis stayed seated, leaning back in his fine, well-balanced office chair, his feet firmly resting on his desk. "Okay, take a seat, you two." Darren was glad that Lawrence Schmidt was about to suffer the same humiliation he was used to suffering, being seated in a shorter chair before the presiding inspector. When they were both seated, the inspector started in. "All right, your show, Brock. What is it?" "Yes, well, I was visiting Chaya Mendel in Brooklyn." He turned to Schmidt. "You don't know who she is." "Yeah, should I?" "No, you shouldn't. But you might remember her husband, Mandy, who was killed by the Russian mafia a year and a half ago in the Diamond District." "No, I don't remember. I do remember they gave it to you in the subway. Anyway, that's your alley, isn't it? Not mine. I can't keep every lousy money laundering murder inside my head. I got enough on my plate with real terrorism, domestic and foreign." "Yes, well," Lewis sat up and then slapped his desk hard. "Damn it! Get to the point, Brock. You're taking this busy man's time up, and mine too." "I will. Right now, Inspector. I was leaving Chaya Mendel's house after visiting with her little boy, with a security detail guarding the house, due to what seemed like a little business of an attempt on my life there a few months ago, which we are almost sure was another Russian mafia thing, which every lead points to, and it's almost wrapped up. Right, Inspector Lewis?" "Well, we have someone of interest. More than one, actually, and we're keeping our eyes very open, and you safe. Let's put it that way." Darren nodded wryly. "Right. I feel very safe in your hands. Anyway, I'm walking toward the subway, and who do you think I saw?" "Just 20 guesses? Come on." "Our very own Omar Shahedullah, walking right in front of the house." Schmidt looked slightly more interested. "Casing it?" "Well, I can't say that for sure. More like walking by, slowly. I don't know, strolling, but deliberate, I think," Lewis chimed in. "Brock, be reasonable. What's the big deal with that? People walk by houses all the time." Darren was ready for that answer and became more assertive than he or Ralph Lewis was used to. He leaned forward in his low chair. "Oh, come on. What are the odds, Inspector? Something just wasn't right about it. That's my detective sense. But why? Why would he have anything to do with Chaya Mendel? His family is of Pakistani Muslim descent and about the farthest thing from the Russian mafia or Kremlin spies or anything Russian." Schmidt stood up. "Well, when you figure that out, let me know. We looked into this guy and nothing." Lewis waved at him. "Sit down, Larry, for just a minute." Schmidt smirked and sat back down. Ralph Lewis turned to Darren. "Brock, remember Stanley coming here to report Mahmoud was missing?" "Sure." "Well, I don't know why, but I'd like to ask Stanley about Omar. Like I said, don't ask me why, but I just know that Omar has been hanging around the Midtown area a lot. I'm curious whether, out of all the Muslims in all Manhattan and beyond, Omar and Mahmoud may have known each other. I'm probably wasting my time and all of our time, and if that's true, I just may dock your pay, Brock." Why hadn't Darren mentioned Omar's name to Mahmoud at Ben's Deli? Could he have known him at least in passing? Inspector Lewis picked up the phone. "Could you come into my office?" Schmidt got up. "Well, while you gentlemen play detective, sit down, Larry." Lewis's executive secretary entered the office. "Could you do me a favor? Connect with 2 officers in the vicinity of the main library and have them call the DeWitt Wallace periodical room and ask about a guy named Stanley, an old Jewish guy. I've got his last name somewhere here, but it doesn't matter. Everyone there will know who he is. If he's there, just have them tell him we may have a lead on his friend. And have them bring him up here right away, in a squad car. You got it? Keep me abreast. And get me a picture of Omar Shahedullah." "Yes, sir." As she left, Schmidt rose again. Look, this is obviously going to take some time, and sit down, Larry. It won't take time. Not in this precinct. Brock, even if he does know who Omar is, that doesn't mean the kid did anything. Lawrence leaned back in the low chair. You said it. Lewis leaned forward. But he would possibly be a person of interest. Would you agree, Larry? Schmidt sighed deeply. I suppose so. You're damn right, Schmidt. Hang on to your suspenders. The secretary popped her head in. They're on their way here with Stanley's sirens on. 2 minutes to arrival. Here's the picture. He grabbed it without looking at it. Good work. As she left, he put the picture on his desk and then got up and cracked his knuckles. Brock, did I ever tell you about the time I beat the mob bosses to a meeting at their own rendezvous point? I got the tip and was there with backup before they got there. Of course, that was in the 1980s. I was a lot younger then. The mob bosses were a lot more dangerous back then when I worked for Rudy. I guess I met you not long after that. Yes, sir. You've told me about that before. I think I met you about 6 months after that. Right. Well, so where are these SOBs with that Stanley, whatever his last name is? I would have had him here 5 minutes ago. Schmidt shook his head. Just don't take forever when he gets here. Just settle down, Larry. I want you to hear this. Then you can go back to catching the bad guys. There was a knock on the door. Lewis delivered his typical yell. Come in. Stanley slowly opened the door and entered. These officers who brought me told me you found Mahmoud. Lewis sat back down. They told you wrong. Not yet. This is Lawrence Schmidt, Homeland Security agent. Darren Brock, you know. Sorry, there's no extra chair. Stanley raised one thick hand up. Mahmoud is no terrorist. Did I say he was? Inspector Lewis pulled the picture off his desk and flashed it at Stanley. You ever seen this guy? Stanley squinted and then moved closer to the picture. Yeah, I think so. Lewis looked at Darren Brock and then Lawrence Schmidt and then back to Stanley. What do you know about him? Nothing. I may have seen him once or twice in the DeWitt Wallace room. I think Mahmoud may have known him, or then maybe not. Maybe at Ben's Deli, but then again, maybe not. Schmidt rolled his eyes. He's a big help. Stanley looked his direction. I know I've seen him somewhere, on the street, somewhere. The face is very familiar. That's all I know. Inspector Lewis went over and shook his hand. Okay, that's all. You can go. We'll update you when we know anything about your friend. Thank you. I don't get a ride back to the library. I can't walk all that way in this heat. What are we, a taxi service? All right, go out there and my secretary will get an officer to take you back. But no sirens this time. When did I ask for sirens? Good. She'll help you. After Stanley left, Darren turned to Lewis. Well, nothing. Maybe we'll interview the poor kid once more. Schmidt stood up and stayed up this time. Okay. Well, now I'm leaving this time waster. Contact me if you end up getting a real tip. Right. You can leave now too, Brock. I'm telling you, there's something going on with this kid, Inspector. You wanted me to assist in this area. I'm just saying, I hear you, but I'm not going to get into profiling here. But he was there, in Brooklyn, at her house. Enough. Back to work. When Ralph Lewis was finally alone in his office, he reached into his bottom right drawer, grabbed the day-old jelly donut, and ate the whole thing in 4 bites. Chapter 35. Naomi was awakened by the crystalline early September sun as it filtered through still green leaves before shining through her bedroom window and dancing around her face. It took 5 or 6 seconds for her to realize that it was Sunday and she didn't have to work. Simultaneous with that thought came a momentary picture of her slowly walking arm in arm with her father under the cherry esplanade in the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens at Prospect Park. She realized that the short early spring blossoming season had long passed. That's when, for the first time in years, she had visited the esplanade without her father. She had run into Mahalia, Abrahat, and Javier, while David Kaplan was at the Kingsbrook Rehabilitation Institute. Suddenly, a pleasant thought crossed her mind. Why not walk under the naked esplanade, arm in arm with her favorite strolling partner, on this sweet, waning summer's day? She arose quickly, washed and dressed, and descended to the first floor. There was David Kaplan sitting at the kitchen table drinking hot tea. She knew he had just finished his morning prayers. His blue velvet phylactery tefillin bag with the scripture boxes and straps for the forehead and arm, and his matching talit prayer shawl bag were sitting on the table. His small Siddur prayer book sat on top of them. Naomi went over and put her arms around her father's shoulder and then kissed the top of his black yarmulke. Abba, let's celebrate your recovery by going to the cherry esplanade. We missed our early spring walk. We can take one now. His eyes looked upward and at a 90-degree angle, as if he was trying to see her as she stood behind him. You know, my daughter, that the Holy One has not promised us cherry blossoms in early September. Naomi responded, as the sages might, with a question. And where in all of Torah are we forbidden to walk beneath bare cherry blossom trees? She could feel his nodding head on her cheek. I suppose so. After breakfast. They spent the next few hours doing just that, eating a leisurely meal together, clearing and cleaning the kosher-for-dairy food plates, silverware, and other eating utensils, and preparing to leave the house and travel to the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens together. By the time they arrived there, it was about 12 o'clock p.m., and the sun was directing its warm midday rays on the summer green grass and blossomless cherry blossom trees. Naomi took her father's arm, and they slowly walked to the cherry esplanade. They had never experienced the esplanade with no blossoms above them, but even without the sweet pink ceiling, the miracle of their father-daughter stroll brought tears to Naomi's eyes. Abba, I thought I lost you. I was sure we'd never walk under these trees together again. I walked here myself in early April, alone. Now when I think of how I complained to you last year under these same trees about how I was in my late 40s and still husbandless and childless like an old prune, like a leftover tzimmus carrot dish from someone else's wedding, that you should have had a son instead. I'm so ashamed. And what did I say? You told me I'm better than 10 sons. That's right. And in agreement with the esteem the Chofetz Chaim had for women, and even more so in your case, because you are you. And you're better than 10 husbands. Well, actually, one would suffice right now. No, Abba, I'm through with all of that. You will suffice, my beloved father and personal sage. When they arrived arm in arm at the end of the esplanade, Naomi looked up as she patted her father's hand. There, not 20 feet from her, was the widow Chaya Mendel with her 5 children. David Kaplan had never met 16-year-old Leah, 13-year-old Shimon, 11-year-old Rina, or 8-year-old Shmuel, but he had met 6-year-old Natan, who immediately ran up to Naomi, stretched out his hands, and hugged her flowery summer dress. Is Darren here? She knelt down and wrapped her arms around him. No, Natan, I'm afraid he isn't. Then she pulled back and looked at him. My goodness, you've grown. You're such a big little boy. She stroked his long Orthodox hair locks. And so handsome. Where's Darren? Chaya just caught Natan's question as her other children left her side to play. She stepped up to Naomi and David. Natan, don't ask Naomi so many questions. It's okay. He just misses him. I guess I do, too. Abba, this is Chaya Mendel. Chaya, this is my father, David Kaplan. David smiled. I've met her sometime last year, and her adorable youngest. Suddenly, Naomi felt compelled, against her better judgment, to ask Chaya about Darren. She spoke just above a whisper, even though she knew Natan's ears could pick up every word she said. So, has he visited you and Natan lately? Who? Chaya asked as if she didn't know. Naomi fidgeted with the straps of her small black cloth handbag. Well, you know. She became even quieter. Darren. Natan jumped up and down and answered affirmatively. Yes, he visited Ima and me, and we played with puzzles and read books and ate cookies, didn't we, Ima? Yes, we did. Then Chaya's eyes found Naomi. And he told me all about, him and Margaret. I congratulated him. Naomi nodded. Yes, I know all about that. Well, I was just curious. Well, it's all for the best. There are Jewish men just as eligible. David had been observing the conversation. His empathetic heart bled for his daughter and the awkward situation she was in, even if she was the cause of it. He didn't know quite what to say, but he had to say something. Well, there's no one who's as eligible as Darren Brock, notwithstanding the fact that Chaya's eyes now found his. Certainly, Mr. Kaplan, you don't think you couldn't be saying that. No, I'm not saying that. We all know the issue at hand. My daughter understands the importance of marrying from among our landsmen. Still, Naomi felt like her right foot could kick her left leg, which was impossible right now, as it would frighten Natan. Why did she even ask about Darren? How utterly stupid. Now she had the obsessive need to let Chaya know that she understood the importance of marrying someone Jewish, that her head was no longer stuffed full with unrealistic dreams, and not only that, she also felt the need to defend herself from the accusation that she would end up an altomoid, an old maid. So even if Chaya intimated that there could be a Jewish man somewhere out there for her, Naomi needed to convince her of that. And right now, she reached into her handbag and started nervously fishing around. Finally, she came up with what she was looking for. She pulled out a small white business card. I understand the need to marry a Jewish man. I do. In fact, I met a very nice man, a dentist, and a very observant Jewish man. We really hit it off, as they say. He asked me out on a date, in fact. David Kaplan could hardly hide his consternation. What? You didn't tell me. I thought... Just this morning, Naomi did something she had almost never done before. She rudely interrupted her father as she handed Chaya the card. His name is Martin Cohen. He's quite dashing, really. He's a recent widower, and you should see how he fell for me. He told me it's unusual for him to be so forward, but he couldn't help himself for some reason, and I believe him. Chaya's eyes widened. Well, what do you know? Martin Cohen's been our dentist for years, and a very good one, very gentle, and yes, very handsome. And it's true that he's a very nice, religious, frum man. I think this is wonderful. You've made quite a catch. Now, don't you lose him. He's eligible, and he's Jewish. This is fate, Naomi Bashir. Don't you think so, Mr. Kaplan? Naomi avoided looking in his direction as he carefully answered, Well, yeah, yes, I suppose so, if it's God's will. And if my oldest daughter is ready to, if she's open to meeting someone just now. Chaya shot back. Well, not now. When? She's not 20 anymore, Mr. Kaplan, and it's not every day that she should get such a high recommendation from someone such as myself, especially when she thought he would be a total stranger to me. Isn't that Bashir? Isn't it? Chaya had a point. Was this the hand of Hashem himself? David Kaplan nodded his head in seeming agreement with Chaya. Well, yes, I suppose that's true. It's just that I thought she said just a few minutes ago that, but yes, I suppose it is a miracle. Yes, I suppose it is. The rest of their time at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens went pleasantly enough. Darren Brock's name didn't come up again, and neither did Dr. Martin Cohen's. After Naomi hugged Natan and said a cordial goodbye to Chaya and the other children, she and her father left Prospect Park for home. On the train, David felt it wise not to mention the disparity between Naomi's celibacy vow and her subsequent dating arrangement with the good dentist. Instead, they discussed an ancient 2nd century Midrashic quote mentioned in the writings of the slightly less ancient 11th century sage Rashi, which Naomi, of course, loved every minute of. She kept her arm entwined with her father's the whole time. When they arrived home, David Kaplan mentioned the need to take a nap. Naomi told him she thought it was a very good idea. Although it was true that David seemed to have fully recovered from the effects of his 2 strokes, it wouldn't be wise to test the God of Israel, who had performed such an obvious miracle, no matter which word he used to perform it. Once David retreated to his bedroom, Naomi sat on the sofa. She watched the hazy end-of-summer late afternoon light through the front living room windows. She could just see a young Hasidic family passing by on the sidewalk outside. First, the rail-thin, young, bearded father, fully clad in black. Then the mother, just as thin, in a long black dress. Then 2 grinning preteen daughters in their own long dresses. And then a little boy about Natan's age with curly side locks. She would never have a family like that woman, taking late summer Sunday walks with her devoted husband and obedient children. But at least she could just perhaps have a man, and a good one, according to Chaya Mendel. And he wasn't a stranger on the subway anymore. He was, in fact, the friend of a friend. She pulled the card out of her handbag, along with her small flip phone. Then she bowed her head. What prayer would be appropriate? Perhaps the well-known Shehechianu prayer. She mouthed the prayer in English. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has kept us in life, sustained us, and brought us, me, to this season, and maybe to Dr. Cohen, to Dr. Martin Cohen. Amen. She took a deep breath and punched the numbers into the small device. She listened to the ring as she put it to her ear. After 4 rings, a recognizable man's voice answered, Yes, Dr. Martin Cohen speaking. She hesitated almost long enough for him to hang up. Finally, she responded, this is I'm Naomi Kaplan. She heard a gasp on the other end. Could it be you, my beautiful one? You have answered my prayer to Hashem. Your stunning eyes and perfectly straight teeth have kept me up at night. He'd noticed her teeth. Well, after all, he was a dentist. Yes, Dr. Cohen, it's me. I had your card in my pocketbook, and I just happened to see it, and no, that's not true. Do you by some chance know a Chaya Mendel? He had been getting ready to attack a plate of pickled herring that sat before him. Now he put his fork down and sat up straight. Do I know her? Are you kidding? I took care of her whole family, including her late husband, Mandy. May he rest in peace. Of course I know her. And how is it you know her, if I may ask? Well, it's a long story, but I happened to mention you to her, and she told me she knew you. She said you're a very nice man and a good dentist, so I thought I'd call you, and it's Bashir is what it is. Don't you think it's Bashir? I'm already feeling like we should get together and talk about it. Yes, I suppose it's Bashir, Naomi responded cautiously, trying to sound as subdued as possible. After all, she had actually taken the initiative to call, a still somewhat strange man on the phone, even if Chaya did know him. Not that there was any other choice. She hadn't given him her number, so he couldn't call her. It would have been too forward to have given that to him on the train. But still, she had called him. He interrupted her mental hesitancy by following up on the Bashir remark. Do you know what? My heart is beating fast right now. And do you know why? God is matchmaking, don't you think? I want to see you again. When can I see you? I want to look at your Shana Punim, your beautiful face. Those Yiddish words prompted a surprising response, and she suddenly became a flirty schoolgirl. Well, I could text you a picture for now, but we'll see. Maybe. I think I have to go now. My father will be getting up from a nap soon, and I have to make dinner for him. Now, Naomi, you're playing with me, aren't you? Please don't hang up. At least not before I get your number. We don't have eternity to get to know each other. Yes, that's what Chaya says. She also says you're very handsome, and I told her she's right. Naomi could hardly believe these words came from her mouth, but somehow she knew he shouldn't be the only one giving compliments. He didn't wait a beat before he responded. So what's the holdup? You're beautiful. I'm handsome. We agree. It's a match made in heaven, as my late wife used to say. Of course, not about you. But I know we have her blessing from above. Naomi ignored those last awkward words and went in for the kill. Well, I suppose we could meet in a public place. Yes, I would like to do that. I work in Manhattan at Macy's, and I could see you someday during my lunch break. Do you know Ben's Deli on 38th Street? Do I know it? Yes, of course. Who doesn't know Ben's Deli? A good kosher place with good food. What about tomorrow, Monday? When do you take your break? Well, let's say 12:30 p.m. at Ben's. Of course, Naomi. I won't sleep well tonight. But when I do finally get to sleep, I'll be dreaming of you. And your number? She gave him her number without hesitancy, which surprised her. But why not? This might just be God's answer to her lonely ache since Darren Brock. Once he wrote down the number, he ended the conversation with a short goodbye. I wish it was tomorrow. Shalom, my love. He hung up, and then she did. Normally, she would immediately second-guess herself, but she didn't have time for that. While she still held the phone in her hand, it rang. Hello? A woman's voice greeted her on the other end of the line. Naomi Kaplan? Naomi couldn't quite place the voice. She'd heard it before, probably in some kind of courtesy call. But this late in the day and on a Sunday yet? Maybe it was the receptionist at Kingsbrook Rehabilitation Institute calling about some medical detail related to David Kaplan's release. Or maybe not. Whoever it was, she would get her off the phone fast so she could spend time processing the call that just ended. Yes? This is Jody Goldberg. Jody Goldberg. Jody who? Oh, yes, Jody, the Messianic wife. Yes, hi. How can I help you, Jody? I hope you're not busy. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to tell you how much should I tell her I'm busy? I suppose that would be rude. How excited I was to hear about your father's no less than miraculous recovery. Oh, that, yes. Abra had told me all about it. I'm so happy for you and your father. Yes, thank you so much. If anyone deserves to be well, it's my beloved father. Jody didn't know quite what to say in response to that remark. There was a short pause. She ended the awkward silence by continuing. Yes, well, I'd be so honored to meet him. I understand my husband knows him. That is,
He knew him as a child when his father Irving would take him to the Linotype room at the New York Times. I guess that was a second surprise after Abrahat spoke that word. And word? Oh, that word. Yeah, she told me she spoke the name Yeshua in a kind of quick prayer. You mean the word Yeshua? It's a word, not necessarily a name. It means God saves. That is, the God of Israel. Jody tried to prevent any edge from infecting her voice. Yes, Naomi, I know that. But when Abrahat used it, I can assure you, I can guarantee it was a name, and not just any name. Naomi could feel her face begin to get hot, and she was sure it was turning red. Is that why you called me? To tell me that? Jody became, against her will, intimidated, and hence somewhat timid. Well, no, but in a way, yes. In a way, that is, I called to rejoice with you over your father's healing, but it just seemed so obvious to me. After all, it was Abrahat, and Naomi unbridled all emotional restraint and released a full measure from her own personal deep reservoir of 2,000-year-old Jewish pain. My father, I will have you know, told me the Hebrew word is just that, a word and not a name. And according to him, it was in this case, may Hashem be praised. Hashem, and not, at any rate, I was there, you weren't. I think I need to go now. Jody cast off her own restraint and lost her own decorum. If she was being humiliated for calling to express thankfulness for a miracle performed in his name, she might as well take off the gloves herself and punch back, in spite of any admonition in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, excuse me, Naomi, before you hang up on me. No, I wasn't there, but my husband was there, and he saw everything, and Abrahat was there, and she breathed the word, as you call it, as a prayer. And yes, you were there too. I grant you that. But your father wasn't there. He was out like a light. So I don't care how wise and righteous and whatever else he is. He wouldn't know whether it was a word or a name in that case, any more than you would know if it was a doctor's scalpel cutting you if you were under anesthesia, or it was a scissors. The only person who would know in what way she used the word Yeshua would be Abrahat. So why don't you just ask her? By this time, Naomi was trembling. She tried to open her mouth to speak, but tears streamed down her cheeks instead. Jody waited for a response until she wondered whether Naomi had hung up, perhaps for good. Finally, she spoke up. So, did you hang up on me, or what? Naomi finally found her trembling voice. No, and as a matter of fact, I will talk to that nurse's attendant. It's Abrahat, and she's more than an attendant. She's a highly trained therapist. Yes, I know that. You don't have to lecture me. Jody made every effort to restore some semblance of gentleness to her spirit. Yes, well, why don't we have you over, and you can bring anyone you want with you, even your father or your rabbi or anyone, and Abrahat will come, and you can ask her there. Your father can ask her there. We'll have a pleasant time, and we'll treat each other with respect, and you can agree to disagree if you want, but at least you'll know what Abrahat's thoughts are. After all, she loved your father enough to pray for him. There was another pause. Finally, a slightly calmer Naomi responded. Well, we just might do that. My father happens to respect all religions. He's that secure in his faith as a Jew, and he taught me the same way. That's why I allowed Abrahat to pray that day, and I'm sure there's a reasonable Jewish explanation for this whole thing. Maybe my father and I will come over, or at least perhaps I will. Of course, we eat glatt kosher, so my father may not eat your food, even if you go out of your way to accommodate us, as you did for me. That's fine. That'll work. You can eat before you come over. I'll talk to Sheldon about a time that might work, and we'll get back to you. Fine, I'll go now. She hung up without waiting for Jody to say goodbye. Then she let out a heaving sigh and flopped down on the couch. It suddenly occurred to her just how far she had come from her and Darren reading the New Testament with intense fascination the year before to this place of defensive anger. Everything had become so much more complicated since she had broken up with him, and even more so since her father's instantaneous recovery. Nevertheless, he'd been healed, and that was something to thank Hashem for. Now she would go up and check on her father, after which she would prepare her mind for her meeting with Dr. Martin Cohen the next day. Chapter 36. By Monday morning, The temperature had dropped 10 degrees to 55, and the cloudless, crystal blue sky was as dry as Arizona. On this morning, the term summer was a mere technical one, considering fall's unignorable presence, and Naomi felt as cool, light, and clear as the day. She had none of the stomach-churning, bowel-loosing nervousness that had accompanied the mornings at work before her lunch breaks with Darren Brock the year before. Instead, she had a relaxed sense of humor about her upcoming Ben's Deli lunch date with Dr. Martin Cohen, DDS. She could choose to be coy, evasive, and simply not care whether he was put off or not. After all, she didn't love him, at least not yet. In fact, she wasn't quite sure she was even doing this whole thing out of any romantic interest. Maybe she was just making a statement to Chaya Mendel that, yes, she could get involved with a religious Jewish man. Even when Mrs. Lazar asked her to stay for an extra 10 minutes before her lunch break in order to assist her with an Internet Sterling flatware order, Naomi stayed relaxed. Dr. Martin Cohen could wait. She would simply text him on the escalator or on the way out of the Macy's 34th Street doors 8 floors below. The 10 minutes turned to 14, and when the time to leave finally arrived, he simply texted back, okay, a lot more succinctly than the irritating Marvin would, and a lot more confidently. She maintained a similar confidence, breathing in the thin September Manhattan air on 7th Avenue, as she held her 49-year-old head high, complete with its newly washed curly brown hair. When she finally arrived at Ben's, there was Martin Cohen, sitting in the same green upholstered booth that both Marvin and Darren sat in before him. He was dressed in a dark gray suit with a crisp white shirt and no tie. As she walked into the deli, she thought, well, I just might marry this one. Maybe 3 times is a charm, love him or not. As soon as Martin saw her, he struggled his way out of the bench seat, grabbing a long-stemmed red rose from the table in the process. He stood before her and bowed low, one hand on his abdomen and one behind him holding the rose, like a musical conductor with a baton. The crown of his Leonard Bernstein, wavy, silver-haired head completed the picture. Then he stood straight and brought his rose-holding hand forward, eliciting a wave of embarrassment in Naomi. Was anyone watching? What if they clapped, like they always seem to do when proposals are made in restaurants and ball games? For you, my fall rose. Naomi tried to be more overwhelmed than embarrassed, as overwhelmed as she had been the year before when Darren Brock first told her of the exotic, dark brown-eyed Eastern European vision his eyes beheld. At that time, she wondered how Darren could possibly be speaking about her. But he was serious, and he finally convinced her that she was indeed a beautiful woman. She wasn't overtaken in the same way with Martin Cohen's remarks, because she wasn't sure just what he was actually seeing before him. Were his eyes beholding what Darren's were? Or was he just flattering her to try to win her, to gain her, and to win her to what? One thing was for sure. She was a virgin, and he definitely wasn't. Still, didn't Chaya say he was a good Jewish man? With that thought, she smiled, nodded, and took the rose. Thank you. She didn't know what more to say, so she scooted into her side of the booth and waited for him to do the same on the other side. He obliged her. The same waitress who had waited on her when Marvin and Darren were with her came with her order pad. She took one look at Cohen and raised her eyebrows. Then she gave him the once-over. She was definitely acting flirtatious. Naomi quickly glanced at her. The waitress was about the same age as she was, a slightly oversized yet somewhat attractive Jewish woman with no wedding ring on her finger. Right then and there, Martin Cohen began to look more appealing to her. She was definitely dating a handsome Jewish professional, and a doctor yet. Not bad. I only have a half-hour break, Dr. Cohen. Then I have to get back to work. Of course. This will be the first of many times, I hope, and perhaps the next time, in a more, shall I say, intimate setting, one in which I might kiss those delicious lips of yours. Naomi's face approached a shade of red, matching the long-stemmed rose. Well, you do work fast, Dr. Cohen. Do you get down to work on the oral work on your dental patients just as quickly? When Martin let out a loud blast of a laugh, Naomi realized she had been quite clever. She wasn't known for her wit, so she knew she was speaking self-protectively. She definitely had to follow up with something more sobering. Dr. Cohen, please, call me Martin. Martin, I once kissed a man I truly loved, and once? Well, twice. And I reserve my kisses for such persons. Of course, I wouldn't expect less. I also am quite selective, and that's why I selected you. I was faithful to my late wife all the years of our marriage, and all my kisses, all of them, and I may say all other expressions of passion, were reserved for her. Now, I've been an extremely lonely man since her untimely passing. When I saw you on the subway, I knew instantly God had provided a remedy for that loneliness. And so I will reserve my kisses as well as those other expressions of passion. And I am a passionate man for just you and only you. Naomi's eyes widened and her voice rose. Dr. Cohen, you are moving entirely too fast for me. You see, I need to get to know you first, if indeed we do happen to continue to see each other, which I'm not sure about right now, and I must say I'm almost doubting. So could we please change the subject? Please. Martin's mouth took on a remorseful expression, pursing in regret while obscuring his professionally white teeth. I'm so very sorry. I must explain that I am a very religious man and very moral. I observe strict Orthodox Jewish halakha and have no addictive habits. I don't smoke, drink to excess, or have any other such liabilities. I am, in addition, a man of what you might call independent wealth. Baruch Hashem, I am ready to provide handsomely for the woman I love for the rest of her life. You see, I tend to hide nothing. What you see is, not to put it too mundanely, what you get. I see, but really, you didn't have to tell me all of that, Dr. Cohen. She chided him, purposely returning to addressing him formally. He tried to ignore the return as he responded. And now, I would love to hear all about you, so I will listen and learn about what I'm sure is a very remarkable person. I can see that in your extraordinary eyes. Well, Dr. Cohen, please, call me Martin. Martin, Dr. Cohen, whatever. First of all, I'm in no way remarkable, and certainly not extraordinary. I'm just an observant, middle-aged Jewish single woman who takes care of her truly extraordinary father, and who works full-time at Macy's, but not on Shabbat, and has a younger sister who is married and has 2 children and lives in Englewood and is not religious. And yes, I loved the man once, but he happened to be a Gentile and a committed Christian. Don't ask me how that happened, because I won't tell you, and it didn't work out. I won't ask, except, did he, with you, to you? My, Martin Cohen, you are inquisitive, aren't you? No, not that. He happens to be a perfect gentleman, and I am, as I said before, a religious Jew. I see. Again, please don't ask how I ended up falling in love with him. Of course, I won't. Just one question, if I may. Are you still in love with him? She tried to limit the pause to a mere few seconds. I think the fact that we are no longer seeing each other should satisfy your curiosity about that. You didn't exactly answer my question, but concerning his background, all I will say is that the heart can make unusual choices all its own. She found herself agreeing with him. Yes, it can. Well, it's good for me that it didn't work out, and that I will be the first, if you understand what I mean. She rolled her eyes and whispered out loud, Martin, please. He didn't hesitate to respond. But Naomi, you don't understand. I want to marry you. We are both in our golden years, and like gold, they are getting more precious by the day. As that precious time goes by, you will find me to be very romantic, and that's why I want to make love to you. After the wedding, of course. Exasperated, she couldn't help but let out a slight giggle. Oh, my goodness. You certainly are different from who? Well, I don't know. From everyone, I guess. And by the way, I'm an excellent dentist, too. Very thorough and very gentle. Just ask Chaya. She'll tell you. About that, I believe you. But we have a dentist already, a very good one. Dr. Scheib. Yes, he is good. Not as good as I am, but good. So tell me more about yourself. There's not much more to tell, Dr. Cohen, except that there is some would call him a Nebish or Schlemiel, but I respect him enough not to call him that, although he certainly is a mama's boy, a man my age by the name of Marvin, and also very religious, and he also wants to marry me, but that won't happen. Good. I would have had to challenge him to a duel, he joked. He would lose, believe me. And let's see what else. My beloved father and I study the great sages of Judaism regularly, and we go to the synagogue every Shabbat, and we're very close. He's the wisest Jew and the wisest man in the world. He was very sick, but he's all better now, Baruch Hashem. But that's another long story. And oh yes, you would very much like him if you met him. Martin immediately interrupted. Then can I meet him soon? After sundown this Saturday, perhaps? Naomi instantly realized that it would probably make her father very happy to meet an Orthodox Jewish dentist like Martin Cohen, DDS. And she could remind him about Chaya's strong endorsement. He would really like that. Even if Naomi didn't continue to see Dr. Cohen, just a smile on her father's newly healed face would be worth the visit. Well, that might be possible. I mean, yes, I think that might work. Good. Give me your address. And then I will drive my silver Lexus to your house this Saturday at, say, 9 o'clock p.m. The Havdalah service ending the Shabbat will be over, and then I will arrive at your door with my heart beating. I hope I can sleep until then. It will be hard for me. She raised her hands like a traffic cop. Now, Martin, please don't make more of it than just a nice visit to meet my father. He couldn't hide his expectant smile. Of course, I understand. Well, look, I've got to leave or I'll be late getting back to work. I will phone you for your address. Right, I'll give it to you then. They both struggled out of their sides of the booth. She took the rose, and he took her by the other hand. Let me walk you back, at least partially. May I, please? Oh, I guess so, if you wish. She had to admit she was enjoying his gentlemanly demeanor. It certainly was the opposite of Marvin. They walked outside and began the trip back. A half a block up, he took her by the hand and gently pulled her into an alley between the stores. Then he moved in close. May I give you just one quick kiss? Martin, I told you. Please, I beg you. You are so beautiful. Just one. Martin. He squeezed her hand as she looked into his eyes. Sweet eyes, sad eyes, and actually kind eyes. She sighed. You are romantic, aren't you? She couldn't believe that she was allowing this, and that she actually wanted it in some far-off, never-lived, youthful, adventurous way. After all, he was extremely handsome. Like Leonard Bernstein, in fact. Okay, Martin. Just a small one. A little one. But that's all. Just one quick one to help you with your loneliness. Oh, Naomi, my Yiddish dove. As she pressed close to him and he turned his head toward her, she noticed for the first time that he had the threads of hearing aids in his ears. Well, he didn't say he was a young man. After that, their lips met. She could feel his pounding heart through her blouse. In the middle of what ended up being anything but short, at least a minute, if not more, she realized she would be late getting back to work. She also remarked to herself that he was actually a surprisingly good kisser, different good than Darren, whom she had to admit she still deeply loved, but phenomenal in his own way. His lips were also smooth, and his breath was extremely fresh, not surprising for a dentist. Somewhere, 2/3 through, she found herself quite passionately kissing him back, and when they were finished, she was completely out of breath. Finally, she found her voice. Oh, my, Martin. My goodness, that was... Oh, Martin, it wasn't short, but I must say it was sweet. Yes, very, you are sweet. I am, as they say, lonely with a tender heart and a recent loss, and I have so much to give. You'll see. I've got to go now, Martin. Please, just let me run back now, or I'll be very late. With that, she exited the alley and quickly walked down the street. He watched her with the same expectant smile on his face. As she began her fast-paced walk back to Macy's, a strong headwind of guilt blew through her blouse and penetrated her heart. From there, it invaded her conscience, bringing a kind of shame she'd never experienced before. I've sinned, oh my. I've been loose. I've transgressed like a woman of the street, a very loose woman. I'm bad, a bad person, like those who hop from bed to bed. And I flirted with them like Jezebel. Why did I do that? Why? I actually kissed a man I just met, and a religious Jew yet, and he's going to meet my father this very Shabbat. And he'll tell him. He seems to tell everything that's on his mind. Oh no, he's got a big mouth, a soft, kissable mouth, like in the Song of Songs, but also a big mouth, a very big mouth. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Well, at least Yom Kippur is just around the corner. By the time Naomi ran up the escalator to the 8th floor, passing shoppers while excusing herself, she managed to quiet her unresolved conscience enough to focus on her afternoon's work. Chapter 37. Stanley missed David Kaplan, and he missed Mahmoud. On Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock a.m., he sat all alone in DeWitt Wallace periodical room of the New York Public Library Manhattan branch, just as he had for the last several months. He didn't know that David Kaplan had experienced an unexplainable recovery. No one had told him. He had visited Kaplan a month before, but that was before the miracle. Stanley tried to read the New York Post that lay stretched out before him. There was plenty of room, since David's New York Times and Mahmoud's Al-Ayam were no longer vying for space. But he couldn't concentrate on the front page articles or anything else inside the edition. He looked over at his bag lunch. He had prepared peanut butter on rye that morning. He was somewhat partial to peanut butter, and he loved New York Jewish rye, but he abhorred the combination. He chose the lethal lamination out of a lack of bread choices, and now that he was hungry for lunch, he had no interest in eating it, or the apple he included with it. What he really wanted was a pastrami on rye with coleslaw and Russian dressing, a kosher pickle and chips, and a Dr. Brown's cream soda to wash it all down. He got up, walked to the garbage can in the center of the room, and promptly dumped the bag with sandwich and apple into the receptacle. It hit the bottom of the almost empty can with a thud of finality. He knew he was wasting good food, but he had no interest in carrying the bag where he was headed. The weather Tuesday was warmer than Monday, more like the late summer it actually was, and cloudy. Stanley walked out of the library and immediately hailed a cab for the 8-minute ride to the 2nd Street Deli in the Midtown East Side section of New York City. Once his large hulking frame was situated in the back seat, he looked into the rearview mirror to see a young man who looked like he might be a young Mahmoud. Where to? 2nd Street Deli? Ah, yes, 33rd Street. That seemed obvious to Stanley. After all, this was the main location. The other 2nd Street delis were many blocks away. Yes, of course. You got it. For a quick instant, Stanley considered the possibility that he had placed himself in the hostile hands of an Islamic extremist. After all, he knew he clearly looked Jewish, somewhat like the lyricist Oscar Hammerstein, as David Kaplan liked to point out. Maybe the goal of this obviously Middle Eastern young man was to drive Stanley somewhere way out of his way and then turn around and shoot or stab him before he could get out of the cab. As soon as that thought entered his mind, he regretted having thought it. If Mahmoud were there in the taxi with him, he would say, "That is not right, my friend. I myself drove a taxi in this city before I retired. Would I harm you? No. And this man will not harm you either. Just because we disagree on Jerusalem does not mean we cannot be good friends." And Mahmoud would be right. After that thought came another. Speaking of Mahmoud, where in the world is he anyway? The driver looked at the rearview mirror. Nice day, is it not? Yeah, but warm for September and a bit humid. That is so. Like my country, except that it was somewhat colder here yesterday. That would not happen. Yeah, it can be changeable this time of year. Stanley didn't want to talk about the weather anymore, or the young man's country, so he maintained silence after that until the driver changed the subject. Good place, that 2nd Street Deli. I've eaten there many times. Yes, I worked at a delicatessen many years ago myself, behind the counter. I know good delis, and I know bad delis. Some I wouldn't eat there if you paid me in gold bricks, but this is a good one. You make me hungry just thinking about eating there, and it is lunchtime. The young man's comments put Stanley at ease. He figured that no one who ate at Jewish delis could be up to no good, Palestinians and other Arabs included. From that point on, the rest of the 8 minutes went quickly. The driver pulled up to the curb, and Stanley got out and paid him. Then he gave him a firm handshake and headed into the restaurant. The original 2nd Street Deli opened in 1954 on 2nd Avenue and East 10th Street in the Yiddish Theater District of Manhattan. Although Yiddish theater had all but disappeared by that time, a Yiddish Walk of Fame was created on the sidewalk just outside its doors, honoring the great Yiddish actors of the prior 50 years. Following the unsolved murder of its founder, Abe Libwell, in 1996, the deli closed briefly. Even Inspector Ralph Lewis, working under the Giuliani administration at the time, was unsuccessful in solving that crime. The deli closed again in 2006 and eventually reopened on 33rd Street. Stanley walked straight to the dining area where several pictures of the great Yiddish star Molly Pecan greeted him. Then, hungry as he was, he took a detour and walked over to the spacious deli counter. He watched the deli workers slicing corned beef and wrapping lox, industriously waiting on a crowd of anxious New York customers. He had to admit he missed the excitement of shouting over the crowd and navigating past fellow workers from one side of the counter to the other. He never worked at this particular deli, but in so many ways they were all the same. The symphonic clink of plates and silverware, the cacophony of gossip, the smell of pickles and pastrami and matzo ball soup. It was all so familiar. He even peripherally knew a few Second Street deli workers, though not by name. But even if they recognized him, they were too busy to acknowledge it. He just stood there and took it all in. Then, just in his sight range, he saw the young man whose picture he was shown at the NYPD Midtown South Precinct offices. He smiled to himself. I guess he's another Arab who can't stay away from Jewish delis. That's what I love about New York City. It's everything Mahmoud says it is. He pressed through the crowd and ended up next to Omar, who seemed very much engaged in staring at something in the opposite direction, toward the dining area. He gently tapped him on the shoulder. Omar snapped his head around, startling Stanley. When their eyes met, Stanley could tell there was something intense and even frightening about Omar's eyes, but perhaps not. Maybe the disruption just surprised him. Stanley remembered that he was shown the photograph of this man in relation to Mahmoud's disappearance. This was his chance to talk to someone who just might know something about where his DeWitt Wallace periodical room friend was. Excuse me, sir. Young man, may I ask you a strange question? Omar instantly recognized Stanley from the library. With an obvious look of disgust, he responded, What is it? Old Jew, what? Omar realized he needed to restrain himself from spitting in this filthy old Jew's face. For his part, Stanley was becoming less and less comfortable around Omar, but this was probably his last opportunity to ask anyone about Mahmoud's whereabouts. I know there are a lot of people in New York and a lot of, people from your part of the world, sir. But by some chance, do you know a retired taxi driver named Mahmoud? And if so, have you seen him recently, if I may ask? Stanley noticed that the young man's teeth clenched and his eyes widened in a fiery blaze. He felt the need to glance away from Omar and down, just in time to see his hand emerge from his pocket with a small silver blade. Instinctively, Stanley pulled back, like the Dallas sheriff when Oswald was shot. He stumbled backward and then turned and tried to lope away. Omar easily caught up with him at the close side of the deli counter. Stanley quickly hopped over a step-like barrier at that open end of the counter and moved behind it. He pushed between two deli men and grabbed a round silver tray to use as a shield. A quarter-pound of thinly sliced cheese slid off the tray and onto the floor. Omar quickly put the knife back in his pocket, but his eyes fixed on Stanley. Now that Stanley was onto him, it was obvious that he had to die before he could call the police. But how? He quickly realized that if he could get behind the counter, he could subtly pull the small blade out and thrust it below Stanley's ribs, and then flee. Omar ran to the other side of the counter as two deli men were challenging Stanley about the tray. His 76-year-old obese heart pounding, Stanley saw Omar going behind the counter from the other end. He clutched the tray and ran out the near side as Omar stumbled and reversed direction. When Omar caught up with him, he pulled the blade out and tried to thrust it toward Stanley, who deftly, with the consummate skill of a deli man, raised the shield just in time for the blade to clink against it. This occurred 3 times until Omar realized he was attracting attention. But the crowd around them was too focused on chopped liver and roast beef to realize what was going on. Omar looked both ways and then fled without killing his overstuffed, overtall, overaged Jewish prey. Stanley thought it best not to follow him. He knew he'd just escaped death. He also knew he had to use someone's cell phone and call the police, specifically Inspector Lewis or Detective Brock. Omar walked swiftly down the street. Suddenly, he felt his secure phone vibrate in his pocket. He darted into an alley and pulled it out. He was hoping it was his Pakistani contact, but it wasn't. A familiar Russian voice spoke on the other end.
Stupid Arab idiot. What were you doing in that deli? Trying to kill that old man. We told you, do what we say. We pick you up next block.
No, and out of breath, Omar insisted.
Then we kill you before you kill infidel.
You kill me. Okay.
Even better, we have Mahmoud's body, whom you murdered. It is preserved for evidence. We will make sure you go to American jail for life, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. At next corner, get in car. We will hide you. Then you kill Darren Brock for us.
This time you succeed. Next corner. Omar left the alley and walked slowly forward toward the corner. Before he could even choose to flee, two large muscular men in tight jeans and black long-sleeve shirts grabbed him and threw him into the rear seat of a late-model gun-gray Hyundai Sonata. Chapter 38. Naomi was tired by the time she entered the subway after work on Tuesday. She was thankful to have found an unoccupied inside seat so she could rest her head against the window. There had been a flurry of customers over the last 2 hours that ended up being more like a snowstorm in late summer. She could never figure out why that happened. There were no special sales and no holidays in sight. Maybe on this day, God was choosing to bless Macy's, resulting in a kind of curse for her, considering that she was working the department alone that afternoon. She tried not to think about her lurid date with Martin Cohen, DDS, or the call and tense conversation with Jody Goldberg. The latter effort ended up being particularly impossible. She could just hear her cheap flip phone begin to ring in her handbag, and when she pulled it out, she recognized the same number that she'd seen a few days before, Jody Goldberg. Oh, brother. Yes? Naomi, this is Jody Goldberg. Oh, Naomi responded as nonchalantly as she could. Can you talk now? It sounds like you might be on the subway. I am. Part of Naomi wanted to say she couldn't talk, and the other part wanted to get the phone call over with. But I can talk for a few minutes. Good. Remember we talked about that meeting with Abrahat? How could she forget? Jody continued. Well, what about Thursday night, 7 o'clock p.m. at my house? We can have something light, if you'd like, dairy on paper plates with plastic utensils, and we can talk. Would that work? Naomi realized she would have to find some excuse to tell her father about where she was going. She had no intention of asking him to go with her, as Jody had suggested in the earlier phone call, but all things being equal, she supposed that Thursday evening was as good as any. The wisest Jew in the world, her beloved father, David Kaplan, didn't have to be present in order for her to express his learned opinion. Yeshua was a thing, not a person, a thing meaning salvation. Oh, okay, I'll be there. Great, see you then. Naomi felt even more exhausted after the call. She leaned against the window for the next half hour and tried unsuccessfully to sleep. When she finally arrived at the Brooklyn home she shared with her father, he was in the kitchen cooking something. He hadn't heard her come in the house. For a few seconds, she stood there at the entrance to the kitchen and marveled at the continued improvement in his health. He was getting stronger day by day. Eventually, she cleared her throat so she wouldn't frighten him, and he turned around and smiled. She went over and hugged his shoulders. I love you, Abba. I've cooked dinner for us. Blintzes with sour cream and potatoes. It smells wonderful. David turned the oven off while Naomi got the plates from the dairy side of the cupboard. She waited until all of the food was on the table, including iced tea. Then she broached the subject of Thursday evening. Abba, I have to be out with some friends on Thursday night. Remember Abrahat? Of course I do. Well, she's one of them, and some others, just some friends who happen to know her. You know, some people who kind of visit the Kingsbrook Rehabilitation Institute sometimes at someone's house. Will you be okay here at home? Yes, of course. You have your life. And you can see that I can cook my own dinner. I'll do that beforehand, Abba. You can just heat it up. No, I like cooking. It gives me something to do. That was easy. And guess what, Abba? That Jewish dentist is coming over Saturday night after Shabbat. He wants to meet you. Oh, that would be nice. Very nice. I'd like to meet him. By the way, have you heard from Darren? Does he know I'm home and feeling better, Baruch Hashem? She hadn't thought about whether Darren was aware of her father's amazing recovery. After intentionally having no contact with him, she hadn't even considered who might have told him, but she had a guess. I'm sure Lisa must have let him know, Abba. And in time, I would think that he would at least call you. Anyway, let's say the blessing before the blintzes and potatoes get cold. They prayed the Barakah blessing before the meal. That was the beginning of a lovely but short evening at home. It consisted of David quoting and then translating witty Yiddish jokes. This infrequent pastime of theirs convinced her that the joke she had told Martin Cohen about his dental patients actually did have some roots in these recitations of Jewish humor. But as enjoyable as the evening was, Naomi increasingly felt the effects of a very draining day and decided to go to bed early. However, after 2 listless hours, she sat up in bed and stared at the light from the street lamp as it bled through her window blinds. It occurred to her that this partial illumination perfectly represented her extremely partial view of truth and meaning in her life. As much as she loved her father dearly and had learned so much from him, she still had so many unanswered questions. What God did Darren worship? If it was the same God as hers, then exactly who was the God she professed to worship? That year-old question still remained unanswered. Furthermore, what God did Abraham worship? And how and why did God answer her prayer for Naomi's father, whatever that prayer was all about? As her questions continued, they got deeper and wider, and consequently more confusing. Why was she put on the earth? Was it just to work at Macy's to help her father until he died, and then to die herself, an old, single, and childless woman? Or as the mid-to-late life wife of a dentist who seemed to be desperately looking for nothing more than a spousal replacement, like a new hearing aid battery? Even Jewish philosophers Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig couldn't answer those questions. A lonely teardrop dripped from her left eye. She brushed it away with her left hand. Then she lay back down and tried to sleep. It took another 2 hours to accomplish that task. She woke up early Wednesday morning every bit as tired as the night before. She knew she would trudge through that day, longing for her pillow that night. Her only hope was a good night's sleep Wednesday night. And when that finally came, her desire was only granted because she took 4 Advils at 11 o'clock p.m. By the time Thursday came, her mind was fixed on that evening. How could she impress on Abrahat and the Goldbergs that she was right about the word Yeshua and they were wrong? Although she didn't have that answer, she did know one thing. By that time, she had regained her spiritual equilibrium, so she was sure she was right. By the sovereign hand of the Holy One of Israel, there were very few customers all that afternoon. And what customers there were just pulled small items like funnels and colanders off the wall, and items as large as toasters and mixers off the shelves, and brought them to the register for purchase. By the time Naomi traveled 8 floors down the escalator and out the doors to 34th Street, she had a surprising bounce in her step. She would tell those people what her father told her, and she would thank Abrahat for being so kind to her father, and everything would be okay. She sat on the bench seat of the crowded subway car, alert and reading the back page of a young man's New York Post. The 45 or so minutes went quickly, and within a few minutes after that, at 6:55 p.m., she was standing in front of Sheldon and Jody Goldberg's Brooklyn Brownstone. She took a deep breath and walked up to the front door. It opened as soon as she knocked on it. She might as well have heard a group of birthday well-wishers say, "Surprise!" although she didn't. There, standing in the hallway, were Jody and Sheldon Goldberg, Abrahat, Mahalia Morse, Javier, Jeremy and Joshua, and, of all people, Darren Brock. She didn't see Margaret because she was in the bathroom at the time. Naomi's face turned red. This was not what she expected. Nevertheless, she greeted them one by one, Sheldon, Mahalia, the boys, everyone. When she got to Darren, she held out her hand and then shook his firmly. "Inspector Brock, I'm surprised. I came here to have a quiet talk with Abrahat and the Goldbergs. I'm not quite sure why you're here." Darren didn't miss a beat. By this time, in their severed relationship, he wasn't about to apologize for anything. "I believe because I was invited, Miss Kaplan. I normally accept invitations from my friends." He walked away toward the living room. Naomi was taken aback. She was not used to a sardonic response from the kindest man she'd ever met, besides her father. As she turned around, Jody addressed her. "I hope you don't mind my inviting some of our mutual friends." Of course not. I'm sure there'll be time to talk to Abrahat later, alone or perhaps with a few others like Rabbi Goldberg and myself." Naomi wasn't quite sure what the strategy was. Were they all planning to gang up on her, so to speak? Well, she could always insist on talking to Abrahat alone. Just then, her father's devoted helper came up and gave her a heartfelt hug. She sensed a genuineness she couldn't deny. "Abrahat, I'm actually here to see you. I'm so happy to see you again. My father is doing well, and I know he wants to see you soon. I think about him every day. I did not want to disturb him so soon, but I would like to visit him. And you and I will talk tonight. But come, we will all go in the dining room now and have something to eat." She left, as did everyone else except the boys. Naomi got on her knees and hugged Javier. Then she looked into his eyes. "Javier, it's wonderful to see you again. Every time I see you since we met at the Midwood Press, you get bigger and more handsome." Javier didn't know what to do with that compliment. He looked down and then gave one of his usual defensive, humorous remarks. "Well, you've gotten older, too." After she laughed as warmly as she could, she took Jeremy and Joshua's hands in each of her hands and looked up at them. "My, you two boys are also growing. I wish you would visit me at Macy's sometime. We had such fun picking out carving knives for your father, didn't we?" Jeremy smiled. "Dangerous ones." Joshua, as the younger brother, giggled. "Yeah." Naomi didn't notice Darren staring at her from the dining room. Margaret was still in the bathroom. If she was in the hall instead, she would unquestionably have been jealous to see him looking at Naomi that way. Naomi wasn't only oblivious to Darren, she also didn't notice someone else coming in the still unlocked front door. Right after she finally did notice Darren staring at her, he turned and noticed the latecomer. The stress in his voice was apparent. "Omar, what are you doing here?" Naomi turned around. Omar looked frightened, nervous. This was his last and only chance to kill the infidel, albeit just a few of them, no thanks to the godless Russians. He opened his black, lightweight, full trench coat. She could just see what appeared to be red sticks of some sort and wires. Could it be? He opened his mouth and said with a surprisingly weak, crackling voice, "Allahu Akbar." Naomi screamed, "Everyone get back!" Then, while Omar was nervously fiddling with something in his pocket, Naomi grasped all three boys and fell to the ground, pulling them down and under her body in the process and shielding them. Javier squirmed to free himself, but she held him tight. Finally, less than half of the sticks exploded. Like almost everything else Omar tried to do to kill the infidel, save the knifing of Mahmoud. He was sloppy and unprofessional in his work. Still, the explosion was strong enough to completely blow him apart, with one leg ending up in the foyer and another at the entrance to the living room. His severed head and part of his spine ended up just next to Naomi, although she was hunched over and barely conscious, and consequently didn't see it. She was bleeding from the head, with burns to her scalp. The boys were completely safe, uninjured. They remained under her, still in shock. The overall structure of the house remained uncompromised, although there was debris everywhere. Darren ran over to Naomi just as Margaret, who had been fixing her hair when the explosion occurred, stepped out of the bathroom. He took one look at his girlfriend and shouted, "Call 911! Call 911!" Chapter 39, The Second Fall. David Kaplan sat in the inpatient surgical waiting room at Maimonides Medical Center. He had walked the halls of the center's pediatric cancer wing in the wintertime, every December 25th to be specific, for the last several years. Dressed as Santa Claus, he had watched the smiles on the otherwise suffering faces of countless children. Now he was watching the pained, impatient faces of his own grandchildren, Lindsay and Noah. Noah was fidgeting and flailing next to Lisa like any bored 8-year-old boy might, with the added dynamic of fear of death, not his own, but his aunt's. Lisa sat to his right, and her husband Mark to his left, and his 11-year-old sister Lindsay sat to Mark's left, purposely separated from her brother. Noah whined as his arms reached around his mother's neck, threatening her perfectly curled late summer, early fall haircut. "Mommy, how long will we be here? I'm hungry," Mark responded, Lisa having performed that task a minute or so before. "Stop it, Noah. Behave yourself. We told you, we don't know when the doctor will be finished. We'll eat soon." "Is Aunt Naomi going to die?" Lisa did the honors this time. "Noah, don't even think that." Lindsay peered around her father. "But, Mommy, do you think she might not survive?" Before Lisa could respond, Noah had another question. "If she lives, will she be ugly?" David, who was understandably in shock after hearing about the explosion, finally forced himself to find his voice. He got up from the orange fabric and plastic seat he had chosen and walked a few orange seats over to his family. He leaned over and took Noah's hand. Then he stretched over to Lindsay and took her hand as well. My precious children, this is not your Aunt Naomi's time for Hashem to take her. And I believe she is even now quietly praying the Mishaberach prayer for healing. Do you know the Mishaberach prayer? Noah shrugged. Lindsay brushed her hair aside and said, I think so. You prayed it with us, Grandpa. Well, Lindsay, she's praying it to God. And she also is saying to herself, I must get all better so I can see my wonderful niece and nephew and tell them I love them. And when she sees both of you, she will be more beautiful than ever. Lindsay had a follow-up question. Like, after Darren fell in love with her? Lisa interrupted the conversation. We'll see. Now, no more questions. Come on. We'll go to the cafeteria and get something to eat. Mark, take the alert thingy with you so they can tell us when the doctor wants to speak to us. You mean the pager? Whatever. Are you coming, Daddy? No, I'm not hungry. I'll just stay here and wait. You should eat something. They'll alert us down there. I think I want to stay here, Lisa. We can bring something back. They have some nice kosher meals. No, thank you. By this time, Noah was pulling on his mother's arm. All right. We'll be back soon. After his family left, David Kaplan stared at the clock on the wall opposite the chair and prayed his own personal prayers. He also thought his own personal thoughts for the first time since he had been called by Lisa with the terrible news. Hashem, I've prayed the Mishaberach prayer many times since I heard, but I wish I was as sure as I told my grandchildren, sure that she won't. David's prayers ended and his meditation started. What was she doing at that Sheldon Goldberg's house? Every newspaper in the city, every TV station mentioned what I know now, that Sheldon runs one of those messianic places right here in the middle of Brooklyn, and now everyone knows Naomi was there. Not that I should care about what anyone else thinks about my firstborn daughter, but I don't think I should ask her why she was there, not anytime soon anyway. I don't want her to feel guilty for being in that house, to feel like God punished her for it. And I'm sure there must have been a good reason. Whatever the reason, she saved the lives of those 3 boys. That's the Naomi I know. That's a true mitzvah. And yet, there is something I must say to her when the time is right, if I only could. After all, she is the link God has given me to our Jewish legacy. If only she lives, please God. By the time Mark Silber's family came back with the flashing, vibrating pager, David Kaplan had decided what he must do. And in order to do it, he had to get to the Linotype machine at the Midwood Press. But for now, he was as anxious as they all were to hear what the doctor had to say. Just as Mark returned the pager, right on cue, a nurse opened the door she had been opening all day. Naomi Kaplan family? Lisa made an instant decision that Mark would stay with the children, and he was glad to oblige her. He had seen enough carnage in the last year, what with the violent death of his old boss, Prima, which he had witnessed firsthand. He had no desire to hear any potentially gory diagnosis about anyone. Lisa and David followed the nurse back through the door and down the hall to a small room that was designed to hold not more than 4 or 5 people. The nurse left them there for about 5 minutes. Then the trauma surgeon, Dr. Morgenstern, walked in. Lisa tried to read his eyes beneath his bushy black eyebrows, or to read the eyebrows themselves, but he was too professional for that. In his mid-30s, and a conscientious physician, he had been trained to speak directly and answer all questions. He had also taken the class about taking bedside manner seriously, at least as seriously as his surgical training. Consequently, he was not easy to read before he spoke, and when he did speak, Lisa noted that he spoke words she had heard many times before in real life, books, television, and films. She came through the preliminary surgery as well as could be expected. She's in recovery now. The next 48 hours are crucial. We did everything we could to staunch internal bleeding. We took her down to radiology and gave her a CT scan to pinpoint areas of cranial bleeding, which is to be expected in cases like this. And we set her arm, leg, and a few other bones. A special burn team will deal with her scalp later. She has a severe concussion. Right now, she is in a medically induced coma to ensure she stays calm. We've also intubated her to assist with her breathing. We will reevaluate that after those crucial 48 hours. We have an excellent staff of top-notch nurses and other highly trained technicians, and we will all keep an eye on her. I do suggest that those who know how to pray do that. As I say, the next 48 hours will tell. Why is it always 48 hours, Lisa thought. Her eyes were fixed on Dr. Morgenstern's stethoscope as it rested over his own beating heart. Someday, even this doctor's heart would be stilled in death, as would hers. Hopefully, her big sister's heart wouldn't be stilled any time soon. Just at that moment, it dawned on Lisa that her thoughts over the last year had become increasingly too serious, to be specific, too focused on things related to death. She longed to think light, frivolous, and frankly materialistic thoughts again. She ached to just sit on the backyard deck of her suburban Englewood, New Jersey house and sunbathe while gossiping with her like-minded friends, but she realized that the fall would soon turn to winter, and her big sister Naomi would endure her own winter, taking months to recover, if she even did. And if she didn't, death would envelop Lisa's life like a permanent shroud. Dr. Morgenstern shook each of their hands one by one. You can contact me at any time through my office. I try to stay in close contact with my patients. We will advise you of any change in status either way and let you know when you'll be able to visit Naomi in intensive care, hopefully as soon as possible. Then he bowed slightly and left. As they walked out of the tiny room and down the hallway toward the waiting room door, Lisa put her arm around her father. Are you okay, Daddy? I mean, you just got over your own serious illness. He shrugged. God has not forsaken us. He knows. He knows. How are you doing? Not great. I think we'll take the kids home and get some rest. And if I know Mark, he'll want to go back the other way this afternoon and provide food to the Manhattan delis. We'll take you home on the way. No, I'll take the subway. She stopped him on the other side of the door. Why? We have the car. I need to go somewhere. Daddy, it's been a long night and day. I don't think. Please, Lisa. She sighed. Okay, Daddy. Please call me when you get home. I will. He walked over and gave the children a hug. Then he shook Mark's hand. She'll be okay, God willing. And that means? It means you should be a good Jew, and then you could pray and help her along. Please don't preach to me, Dad. Noah chimed in. Yeah. Lisa put her hands out to halt further discussion. Enough. The doctor said the next 48 hours are crucial. Mark sneered. Why do they always say 48 hours? Let's go home. Dad, call me later. Mark looked at him. Where's he going? None of your business, or apparently mine. Let's go. She practically pushed all three of her family members out the door to the main corridor. David was left alone. He waited until they disappeared around the corner and then began his journey to the Midwood Press. It wasn't until he was the lone passenger on the inside seat of a half-empty subway car that he began to plan out his visit. He planned to write a letter to his oldest daughter. He realized that he could have written it longhand, but he wanted a more official communique, and he didn't have access to a word processing computer, let alone an old-fashioned typewriter. At any rate, it seemed appropriate for him to express himself to his beloved daughter using the machine he had typed on for so many years at the New York Times before retiring way back in 1978, the machine that had been invented back in 1884 by Otto Mergenthaler. That was settled. Now he needed to concentrate on just what to write his daughter. Overall, it needed to be positive, and it needed to communicate the legacy, his legacy, and the legacy of the Jewish people that she would carry into the future. Maybe it wouldn't be a legacy she would leave to her own natural children, but nevertheless, it needed to be one she would. Would what? To whom would she leave it? After a few minutes of thought, he finally decided that he must impress upon her something about the impact of her commitment to traditional Judaism on the next generation, a commitment worthy of the sages, one that awaited the Messiah who was yet to come, and one that honored the Judaism of her ancestors. But how could he do that without making her feel pressured or guilty about anything she might have already been considering, with or without Darren? When David arrived at the Midwood Press, Ben opened the door. Mr. Kaplan, how are you? The last I heard, you were laid up with some serious stuff. Well, Ben, let's just say God had other plans. It's quiet in here today. Yeah, well, I'm kind of holding down the fort for the time being, so to speak. And this isn't school visiting Thursdays, so I guess this is what it looks like when there's not much going on. Even the old Linotype machine is quiet, which isn't normal considering what a noisy contraption it is. How's your daughter? She seemed to have such a great time in the spring watching you work that thing. Apparently, Ben hadn't heard about his daughter's injury, even though it took place in Midwood, not far from where they were. It seemed odd that a printer like Ben wouldn't even have read about it in the newspaper, but David didn't want to discuss that now. He chose a vague answer. She's been better, but, Ben, do you think I maybe might make a little noise with that Linotype machine? I just want to print a little something. I realize this is a business, and the children aren't here today, but if you don't mind. Ben put his hand on David's shoulder. For you, the greatest Linotype operator in the history of the New York Times? Are you kidding? Be my guest. You know how to fire it up. It's all over there, including printer's ink and paper. I'll be in the office doing some paperwork. After Ben walked away, David approached the machine. He flipped the switch. It began to hum and click as its various parts swung into position. He sat down and closed his eyes. He laid his right hand over the oddly shaped keyboard without actually touching the keys, and then moved his lips without actually speaking aloud. Hashem, you gave Israel the Torah that sustains our people to this very day. Could you not give me a few meager words to encourage my daughter, who is healing at the hospital, which is named after one of your greatest sages, that she might follow that sage's admonishment to keep Torah? He opened his eyes and looked up at the magazine that held the many matrices, the metallic letters that would be used to mold the lead sentence slugs. The escapement patiently and obediently waited for him to release the matrices down the channels like quicksilver messengers as he delicately tapped on the keys. He had already decided to keep the letter short, but was still considering just what to say. He could have written out the notes beforehand, but he decided to just edit the thing in his head. He knew pretty much what he wanted to say, and he knew that as he typed, the Linotype machine would respond to his every command. Still, as he started, the first sounds of clinks, clicks, and metal-sprocketed chains strangely startled him. My dear and beloved daughter Naomi, as I type on this Linotype machine where we sat together not long ago, you are lying in a coma after saving the lives of 3 young children. I can't tell you how full my heart is that you performed such a mitzvah. You obeyed Moshe, who told us to preserve life. David had used the space-band lever for spacing the letters while he pressed the keys that released the letter matrices, and the sentences began to appear in the assembler. He had triggered the caster at the end of each line so that hot lead could be released to create the slugs. Now he paused. The first line seemed acceptable. If by God's design he never got a chance to speak to his oldest daughter again in person, he wanted, if possible, to let her know how proud he was of her before she passed from this world. He took a slow breath and hesitated before finally continuing. I know you have an inquisitive mind and have asked many excellent questions worthy of the sages. No one on earth has the answers to all of those questions, but I want you to always ask them, like our father Abraham did when he stood before Hashem in the matter of his nephew Lot. Yet, as your loving father, whom I'm sure you will outlive by many years, I want you to always remember that the answers are in our Jewish tradition, even as you respect the faith tradition of the other, as I've always taught you. It's true that you may never have your own natural children, but in God's wisdom and God's way, you will carry the legacy of our forefathers into the future, even for your niece and nephew and many other nameless Jewish children. He paused. Should he say the one last thing that was on his mind? Yes, and then he would finish. That legacy includes the words of our great sage Maimonides, who said he believed with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, by which he meant our Messiah. By keeping our legacy, you will usher him in, your loving Abba. As David Kaplan watched the distribution mechanism return the matrices to the magazine section, like soldiers returning to their barracks, he had second thoughts. Perhaps he should similarly return to his imagination what he just wrote before he ended up arranging the lead sentence slugs on a tray for printing. But instead, he pounded his fist just to the right of the keyboard. No, he would prepare the letter, put it in an envelope, and wait for the right method and moment to give it to Naomi. Until then, he would visit his daughter and stay devotedly by her side, praying to a compassionate God for her recovery. Chapter 40. What color is black? Or is it? The altered logic in that blurry meditation echoed through the ink-black darkness of a narrow path somewhere in the folds of Naomi's brain. It was dull, circular, perseverating, obsessive. If her sight was a formless void, her hearing was anything but. Even after such a concussive explosion, it was miraculously crisp and sharp and very clear, picking up the random buzz of a monitor, the rhythmic thud of her heartbeat, the amplified whisper of the medical team led by Dr. Morgenstern. We'll have to deal with the cervical plexus in the back of the neck. Yes, I see that. Fortunately, she covered her face, but there may still be issues there. Later, another voice. Like almost everything else comes later, Dr. Morgenstern responded. Right, but not the significant brain swelling with a large hematoma and the attendant cranial blood. But fortunately, no skull fracture. He continued to diagnose and instruct. Amazing, I would say, but of course, we will need to address fractures in C5 and C6. Yes. Permanent paralysis below that? The doctor lowered his voice pensively. I wouldn't say categorically, but there's a definite chance. A third voice. And grafts to the significant scalp burns, right? Yes, but later, of course. Prepare the Silbadine cream and the adaptic dressing and gauze. The burn team will evaluate for skin grafting in a few days. A young, ambitious intern chimed in. Her face is pretty swollen from the bomb's impact. There could probably be some significant damage to the facial muscles, don't you think? But it could have been much worse. Still, I hope she wasn't too pretty. A fourth voice jumped in before Dr. Morgenstern could. This time, a woman's, Shh, don't say that. Who's listening? Maybe she is. Yeah, right. Well, let's just hope she lives, okay? The intern continued. Well, if she does live, she may need a wig, what with those scalp burns. My, aren't we putting the cart before the horse? I'm thinking ahead. Well, some people's hair grows back. Dr. Morgenstern broke in on the banter. Increase antibiotic drip and hope for no pneumonia. Of course. Continued induced coma with pentobarbital. Keep an eye on the dosage. Check. All right, we'll keep a very close watch, especially here in ICU for the next 48 hours. Check. Check is a funny word, like black. Now I'll really be ugly. Check. Help me, God, help. Over the next few hours, or maybe it was days, Naomi sensed the bustling and fiddling of aides and nurses as they seemed to be applying something wet to her head and what she supposed was some kind of brace around her neck. She was sleeping when she was taken to radiology for the CT scan. When she finally woke up, her perceptive ears picked up the stray words of a distant conversation. Only 5 minutes. Are you family? Family. Oh, yes, oh, sure. I'm family. We have plans, she and I. We do. A familiar man's voice, an unpleasant feeling one. Will she die? Shh. And the same voice, mumbling. What color is black again? Blood red? Death? Dying? Am I? The irritating man's voice came close, too close. My mother told me to forgive you for visiting that messianic place. Marvin. I said a Misha Barak prayer for you at synagogue, and I told God I would marry you, even if you're crippled and you have to wear a wig like the Chassids. So I hope you will love me now. My mother says we're a match made by Hashem. So will you marry me and make a kosher home for me? I forgive you for going to that place, and for that guy Darren. May God forgive him for whatever he did to you. Will you? You don't have to answer now. I mean, you can't yet, but when you can... No, never. Go away, Marvin. Go away. I think you can hear me, and you're saying yes. They say people in comas can hear, and they told me you were comatose right now, which I think means you're in a coma. So are you saying yes? I hope so. I will come back, and maybe you will tell me then. Never. Leave and never come back. Just go. Go. Well, I'm leaving now. Good. I'll say hello to my mother. Don't do me any favors. Well, I'm leaving. I'll pray a Misha Barak prayer every day and see you soon. Marvin, I do appreciate the prayer, but I don't know what color black is, and you're the last one I want to tell me. Now go away. Silence, save hypnotic periodic beeping and clicking. Another man's voice, another Misha Barak. Misha Barak, Abotenu, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. May the one who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, bless and heal the one who is ill. Abba, oh, Abba, my precious Naomi, my precious daughter. He was glad she couldn't see the tears streaming from his eyes like water from the rock at Horeb in the Torah. The Linotype legacy letter was hidden in the inner pocket of his black jacket, and it would remain hidden for now. Naomi, you have saved the whole world. I'm confused, Abba. What color is black? And how could I save the world? Maybe it's not you. Maybe it's only your voice telling me strange things. You saved the life of those 3 boys. You fulfilled the greatest mitzvah, my daughter, whether you saved one of ours or one of the others. He who saves one soul, it's as if he saved the whole world. Oh, I understand, Abba. Then David suddenly started to weep in jagged heaves and began moaning and wailing. She could just feel his folded hands stirring the sheets next to her leg. Abba, why are you crying so much? Maybe because you know where I was at the Messianic place. He repeated the prayer for healing. Mishaberach Abotenu Abraham Yitzchak V'Yaakov. Then he arose. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cry. She could just hear him blowing his nose. I will let you rest now. I just want to say that you have to live, Naomi. You have to live and carry on our legacy as a people. I know you can't hear me now, but I will give you a letter but that's for another time. I will be back. She could feel his lips just touch the gauze over her scalp. Then more silence, not even a beep or click. She lay completely still, listening to her own breathing. She drifted off to a fever sleep without the fever, where distorted reality continued in a dream state, along with comatose perseveration. Darren, is it you? Is that you, Darren? Yes, there you are, with your wonderful porcelain nose and electric blue eyes, and your shock of yellow straw hair. I love that hair. Can you tell me what color black is? Can you? What color is it? Wait, don't leave. Kiss me like you did at the Channel Gardens in the pouring rain under your big black umbrella. No, don't. We can't ever marry. You have to go. Leave. Wait, please, don't go. Can you tell me what color black is? Don't go. Don't go. The real Darren Brock was at the Manhattan Midtown South Precinct Station. He had every intention of visiting Naomi at the intensive care unit of Maimonides Medical Center. He knew she was in an induced coma in guarded condition, but Inspector Ralph Lewis had asked for an immediate meeting with him and Homeland Security Agent Lawrence Schmidt. Margaret, dressed in her full police uniform, her blonde hair protruding from her cap, entered Lewis's room, uninvited. But the inspector saw no harm in letting her stay. He didn't offer chairs to any of them as he normally would. They all stood. Lewis' agitated state was obvious. He began by addressing Schmidt. Well, Schmidt, you and I were wrong, and Brock was right. Frankly, Schmidt, it could cost you your job, Schmidt responded defensively. We partnered with the NYPD, remember? What about your job? Anyway, everything points to a lone actor. A good kid gone bad, just influenced by the internet, from what I understand so far. Darren was surprised by Schmidt's confidence. His long-time hunch, which Schmidt still seemed to be ignoring, told him something else. That's a little premature, isn't it? That's what they pay me the big bucks for, Brock. As Margaret grabbed and squeezed Darren's hand supportively and sensually, Lewis fired back at Lawrence. Looks like someone else paid Larry. Someone by the name of Ms. Naomi Kaplan. As soon as Naomi's name was mentioned, Margaret let go of Darren's hand. He had endeavored not to accuse either Ralph Lewis or Lawrence Schmidt, but he couldn't restrain himself any longer. He turned to Ralph Lewis. Thank you for remembering that, Inspector Lewis. I hate to mention it, but if you both listen to me, Naomi, his voice cracked and shook as he spoke her name, Kaplan, wouldn't be. The shaking in his voice increased as his eyes unexpectedly and unprofessionally moistened. Hanging on to life right now, he cleared his throat. And I admit without direct evidence, that there's some kind of connection between those who tried to take my life, the Russians last year and this year, and Omar's attempt at Sheldon Goldberg's house. Don't ask me why I feel that way. I just do. This time Inspector Lewis responded, while Margaret put her hand on Darren's shoulder to comfort him. You're crazy, Brock. This was obviously an Islamic radical terrorist act. The kid as much as declared it. The other was clearly a Russian connection related to your prior investigation of the mob boss Prima and the whole Mandy Mendel Diamond District thing that's still being investigated. Maybe I shouldn't have asked you to get involved with the whole Omar Shahadullah thing in the first place. Then you wouldn't be so mixed up. Do me a favor and let us handle this investigation. You stick with the Russians and the Italians, or what's left of them. So that's a demotion, then? I didn't say that, Brock. Yeah, well, maybe now is the time for me to finally quit and start that children's ministry like I was going to last year when you threw me the bone of visiting the widow Chaya Mendel and her son Natan. That was a bone? I thought you loved the little Hasidic kid. You want to quit? Quit, damn it. I'm not going to beg you to stay this time. There's the door. He pointed to the closed door. as if no one knew where it was. Margaret saw where things were going and spoke up. Darren, please, you don't want to do that. Let's all just calm down. Inspector, he's just upset about Naomi Kaplan probably being on her deathbed. That's all it is. Darren pushed back on her presumption. Don't say that, Margaret. She can't die. She can't and she won't. Margaret tried to finish any discussion about Naomi by agreeing with Darren. Well, she won't. I'm sure she won't. I bet she even attends our wedding. Darren nodded obligingly. Ralph, for his part, wasn't finished with his tirade against Darren. I'll tell you what, Margaret. I'm tired of Darren's belly aching. How about if I promote you to his detective position? How about that? Then you can be the breadwinner, and he can chase little gangbangers around and blow their noses. Lawrence Schmidt hadn't been paying attention to any of the back-and-forth arguing. Instead, he had been trying to rationalize his strategic failure. He had come up with nothing, but he felt compelled to say something. Look, if you're finished, I'd like to get back to my office, but I will admit this one fell through the proverbial cracks. Okay, it happens, so we learn for the next time, but we can't use this kind of example to suspect every Muslim. And anyway, it could have been much worse. Darren shot back. No, we can't necessarily profile. For instance, in the case of the missing Mahmoud, and it would have been worse, except for he found himself unable to repeat Naomi's name again, so he just stood in silence. Ralph Lewis took note. He was beginning to feel regret for losing his temper and ended up exposing his unguarded heart, which was very unusual for him. Look, I kind of got carried away. My reason for calling both of you here was just to debrief with you. But I guess I kind of let things get away from me. Larry, just keep in touch about what our team of HS and NYPD guys are seeing forensically. And Darren, why don't you go visit Naomi Kaplan in Maimonides ICU? That's all. Would one of you please just close the door on the way out? Everyone left the room. Margaret began to feel insecurities she was working overtime to hide. She once again took Darren's hand. Are you okay, darling? I think so. It's not going to be easy visiting Naomi in her condition, but I think Inspector Lewis is right. They said visitation is restricted to immediate family and clergy right now, and I'm sure law enforcement. I'll probably try to go late this Monday night after work. Why don't you come with me? Part of Margaret wanted to go and stand with her intended as he grieved over Naomi's serious condition. Another part of her hesitated, not wanting to watch him crying over someone he had once professed love for. The hesitant part won out. Maybe I'll visit her with you in a week or so. Why don't you go without me on Monday? Okay. Darren was glad Margaret was there to comfort him. He felt a particular need for her companionship just now, but he was also relieved she decided not to come with him to the Maimonides Medical Center. He knew that feeling had something to do with confusing complications inhabiting his mind and heart, which he was in no condition or mood to try to untangle. Chapter 41. Black was the night, and black was the day. Naomi was suspended between the two, chilled and shivering. Approaching voices increased in volume like a slow fade-up. Finally, the words of medical authority registered in her semi-conscious mind. She's 102.5. Time to watch out for respiratory complications. Increase the antibiotic drip. We'll wait 1 day and then revisit intubation. Very good, doctor. Good? Naomi was swirling and spinning in nauseating rotisserie-like rotations. She could somehow tell she was extremely sick, maybe even dying. If Hashem took her, what color would black be then? Would it be a gray void? Oh, Abba, help, help, Abba, God help me, help me. After an undetermined period of time, she heard two familiar voices. I'm her aunt. Well, technically, I'm not. I'm her friend Marvin's aunt. But to the nursing station, I'm Aunt Ida. How did you get past the border guards? I don't think she has any black relatives. A short laugh. No, I'm not related, but I'm clergy, of sorts. Mahalia Morse. It's a pleasure to meet you. I think she may have mentioned you to me once or twice. It looks like we both broke through enemy lines. It's nice to meet you as well. So how do you happen to know the patient? I met her at a synagogue in Midwood, Beth Yeshua. Aunt Ida and Mahalia and Aunt Ida. I love you both. I do. I love you, Mahalia Morse. I love you, Aunt Ida. Oh, I love you both. I want to tell you before I die. I know you both love me. I know that now. And I'm so glad you met each other. Aunt Ida's curiosity prompted a question for Mahalia. By any chance, do you happen to know a very handsome Gentile man by the name of Darren Brock? You mean that fine man she tossed out of her life like he was some lazy, good-for-nothing womanizer? Yes, that's the very man. The very man she loved and dropped because her father had a stroke. Ridiculous! And now he's going to marry that policewoman. I guess they'll have several waspy blonde babies. Don't make no sense. No sense at all. See, I happen to know her father really liked him, and I believe he would have come around to accepting him into the family. Oh? And Ida paused and then followed up with another question. Have you met her father? No, I haven't, Ida. I haven't had the pleasure. Well, how did you know he liked Darren Brock? Did he tell you that? Let's just say someone whispered it in my ear. May I pray for her? Well, this wouldn't be a clergy call if you didn't. Amen. Naomi, even in her fevered state, could sense Mahalia coming close to her bruised and swollen forehead. She began to speak almost melodically in some kind of strange foreign language. Naomi could tell that she was somehow crying through the syntax of the unusual words. Of course, Naomi couldn't see Aunt Ida's face registering a question mark about Mahalia's sanity and then settling for an acceptance of her Christian holiness, religious fervor. The prayer didn't end up achieving the same immediate results as Abrahat's. The only consequence was a sharp pain in Naomi's heart, or maybe her chest, and a deep cry bypassing her dormant vocal cords. Darren, what have I done? What have I done? Darren. Then there was some nurse-sounding mumbling, after which Aunt Ida spoke first. Naomi, you know you have to get better so we can have dinner at the Applebee's in Newark, and I can give you a good talking to. You can bring some kosher kugel in a napkin. So you get better. Her voice cracked as she spoke that last sentence. Then Mahalia Morse spoke. When, if not, you get better, your scalp burns will be all new skin, like you. What do you mean? There was no answer. Naomi could tell they were gone. She begged for sleep, and within a minute or two she got her wish. But it wasn't a restful sleep. It was more like a visit to the spin cycle of a rocking washing machine, which seemed to border eternity in length. She was hot and nauseated, and then cold and sweaty, and it didn't end by itself. It took another visitor to flip the switch, and this time it definitely wasn't family or clergy. The guest wasn't on the hospital's list. It was after hours, and the rules were a bit lax at those times. The man's voice woke her from a deep sleep to her usual comatose state. Naomi, this is Martin Cohen, the dentist. I've come to wish you, hopefully, a full recovery. And if you try really hard and you do get better, you have a free dental checkup waiting for you. I promise you that. And if your teeth are damaged, I have a surgeon friend who does great work. He hesitated for almost a minute before continuing. Well, Dr. Cohen, is that all? Finally, he broke his own silence. Look, I know you can't hear me, but I have something to say anyway. And I'm glad you're the way you are, because it makes it easier to say it. See, I lost my wife 7 months ago after a long illness, and I'm sure you understand. I'm just not ready for another convalescing person who may or may not. That is, I'm sure you will. But, so what happened to Bashir? And you kissed me on the mouth and told me you loved me. What, am I, a call girl? I thought you were observant, some observant. But I can't. I just can't. So I wanted to pay my respects. I mean, not that you won't. I mean, recover, but I won't be back again to visit. But later, when you're all better, I promise to contact you for the purpose of a free dental appointment, totally free services. I mean, bridges, root canals, even implants, whatever you need after this tragedy. It's the least I can do. And any surgery beyond that, I have a friend in the business who I'm sure will be generous as well. I know him, and I'm sure. Well, anyway, I know you can't hear what I'm saying, but goodbye, Naomi, my Yiddish dove. It was such a pleasure knowing you. I thought you were the next wife Hashem had planned for me, but I'm sure you would understand my having just lost my late wife. God must have other plans. So, his voice lowered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I have to leave now. I hope to have the courage to tell you this someday when you can hear me, but for now, goodbye. What nerve. I have a perfectly good dentist as it is. And he's very orthodox, no trafe, no pork or seafood ever on his hands, like you probably have, you phony. You entered my life, I'm not trained Martin Cohen DDS, without my asking, and you're leaving me like this just when I need you most. I'll never forgive you for treating me this way, never. So why would I ever accept your stupid dental services? She never would have guessed that someone could get so emotionally worked up while in a coma, and she didn't know whether it was good or bad for her prospects of recovery, but she couldn't help it. Chaya was wrong about him. It was a shame about his late wife, but still, this man was no mensch. Darren Brock was much more of a mensch than he was, and Darren wasn't even Jewish. She was glad Martin Cohen was gone. Now she could go back to the spin cycle again. What color is black? Is it getting blacker? I hope not. Chapter 42. The black of the previous night was gone, and a clear fall Sunday dawned. Of course, Naomi couldn't know that, just like she didn't realize that it had been night during Dr. Martin Cohen's visit. During the morning hours, she went in and out of a blurry coma consciousness. In the morning, Abrahet called David Kaplan to make sure he was doing okay. In the early afternoon, she was on the phone with Javier's mother, updating her by explaining that, from everything she'd heard, Naomi was doing as well as possible. Javier hadn't been his usual comedian self since the night Naomi shielded him. He didn't have much of an appetite and spoke little, and he had a hard time getting to sleep and staying asleep. Physically, he checked out fine, but arrangements had been made for him to get counseling from a child therapist. Abrahet made sure to emphasize to his mother that everything possible was being done for Naomi, including much prayer. She asked if Javier wanted to speak with her, but he told her he didn't want to speak to anyone, at least not yet. Then Abrahet called Jeremy and Joshua's parents. Their father ended up answering. Apparently the brothers were faring a bit better, since they each had each other. In contrast to Javier, they wanted to speak to Abrahet. Actually, both of them at once, on the speaker mode of their father's iPhone. How is she? Joshua, let me ask. I asked first. Is she walking yet? Can we talk to her? She's probably all worried about us, asking how we are. Abrahet had determined not to go into great detail about Naomi's condition. She just wanted the boys to know that she was slowly getting better. Well, boys, she is sleeping a lot, and that helps her to get better. I'm going over there today, and I'll tell her you're both perfectly fine. She will be happy to hear that. And tell her about Javier, too, Jeremy interrupted. Tell her he's doing well, too. I will. Is he? Joshua blurted out. He is, but he is having a little problem going to sleep. We're sleeping great all night. They spoke over each other. That is so good, boys, and I know you'll be praying for Javier. He doesn't have a brother like you boys have, or a father to pray with him. After the boys agreed to do that, Abrahet said goodbye to them and then their father. Right after she hung up, she prepared to visit Maimonides Medical Center to see Naomi Kaplan. She had kept in touch with her father, David, and she planned to tell her that she was looking in on him and he was doing well. And then she planned to pray with Naomi, at least a short prayer. She prayed all the way on the subway while leaning on the window with her eyes closed. When she got to the hospital, she remarked to herself that she was as ready as she would ever be to see Naomi and believe the best for her. But when she arrived in her room in the intensive care unit and saw Naomi lying unconscious on the bed with obvious serious injuries to her scalp and torso, doubt throttled her like a strep throat. Her voice quavered and quaked, and she spoke close to Naomi's ear, all the while doubting that any of what she said was getting through. Naomi, it's me, Abrahet. I've come to tell you that your father's doing well. I keep in touch with him several times a day. This morning, he told me he visited you, and he'll be back again soon. I make sure to ask him if he eats and takes good care of himself, and I plan to visit him at his house very soon. May the God of Israel bless you, Abrahet. May he bless you. I know the doctors are doing all they can, and soon you'll be as good as new. She didn't sound as convincing as she wanted to because she wasn't totally convinced. She didn't know much about Naomi's condition, but she was aware of the swelling of her brain and the possibility she might have some paralysis, and she knew about the induced coma, still in doubt's grip, but with faith possibly the size of at least half a mustard seed. She took a deep breath and began her prayer. She spoke the words she had spoken over David Kaplan, but this time it came out more like a question. Yeshua? Yeshua? She paused and then repeated it. Yeshua, God, I pray you heal my friend Naomi. I pray you hear this prayer and do something for her. Please? She continued to pray somewhat anemically for another minute and then held Naomi's hand. Tears filled her eyes, and Naomi could hear her weep. Don't cry, Abrahet. I don't mind that you said that word that means salvation, and I know you care about me. I wish I could dry your tears, but I can't. I don't know if I'll live or die, but I know I love you. Thank you so much for taking care of Abba. I know you'll watch over him." Abraham stayed another few minutes and then kissed Naomi's forehead like her father had and left. Naomi knew she was alone, but Abraham had left some kind of sweet blessing behind, despite her timid prayer. Somehow Naomi could sense that, and the peace associated with the blessing enabled her to fall into a more peaceful sleep than the spin cycle sleep of the night before. Chapter 43. When Naomi awoke, the perseverating obsession with the color black was gone. Something else replaced it, an infinitely brilliant, more than white light that filled all of the space around her. This puzzled her because she somehow knew that her eyes were shut. She spent the next several seconds pondering about the scientific possibility of that, like Moses pondering about the natural impossibility of the burning bush. She was amazed that the light didn't seem like a vision or dream, but was instead very much real and present. Next, she heard a gentle clinking sound that reminded her of only two other similar sounds: the Linotype machine when the letter matrices hit the bottom of the channels, and an internet audio clip she had heard of the first-century high priest's bell that apparently fell from his garment hem and was discovered at the temple site in 2011. As the clinking increased in volume, the light became almost unbearably bright, as if she had opened her eyes in the face of 10 suns. But she hadn't. She was so overwhelmed by these sights and sounds that she barely noticed her medically sedated heart, which had begun to beat furiously. After what seemed like minutes, but she knew was more like seconds, a figure as white as the light began to emerge. She knew that was also impossible, like the concept of a blank canvas, supposedly of a white cow in a blizzard. Just then, the blinding light gave way to a shape, but it wasn't a white cow. It was some sort of human, with arms she could just make out. They were also brilliantly lighted, but not as brilliantly as the face that emerged, with curly hair that seemed to be on fire, and a small beard that she could tell should be brown, although it was too bright for her to be sure. Then, the being began to open eyes that had been shut, and her heart began to beat faster. "Oh no, he's going to look at me." He focused right on her and almost through her, even though her eyes were in reality, if such a thing as reality still existed, still shut. His eyes were dizzyingly three-dimensional, and the depth was all love. She didn't know what to say in the face of a being such as this, but she thought she'd better be polite. "Can I help you, sir?" A male voice that she could only describe as a combination of every voice of every tender man she'd ever been exposed to in her life, from Fred Rogers to David Kaplan to Darren Brock, spoke from the center of the whiter-than-white light. "Your sins are forgiven." She could only surmise that she had been caught. Someone from heaven had taken note. I'm so sorry, but Dr. Cohen kissed me first. Still, I admit I enjoyed it, so I apologize for that." "Naomi?" When the voice spoke her name for the first time, she felt totally seen through, completely transparent, fully known, and for the first time since the visit began, she was convinced who it was, although she had been doing her best to deny it until then. He continued, "Let me show you something." He lifted his right arm until she could see the inapproachable light through an undeniable hole in his wrist. "What does that say to you, Naomi?" Since you asked, St. Patrick's Cathedral is the first thing that comes to mind. They've got a lot of crucifixes there. You should excuse the expression, but isn't it in the hands and not the wrists? Not that I've ever paid much attention. Anyway, that's what it reminds me of." Just then, when she half expected him to get angry at her response, she detected a pure and innocent grin. "That was not the intention of the God of Israel, Naomi, or the former slave Patrick for that matter. I desire that it say, gift to you." By this time, his eyes told her that she was in the presence of some sort of pure holiness, Hashem's holiness, and she began to do more listening than speaking. "Oh, the gift of forgiveness, the kind of gift you can give to others, Naomi, like Joseph did his brothers. Oh, for example, Martin Cohen," she thought he meant for kissing her. Forgiveness for that didn't seem like a great stretch to accomplish, but he read her thoughts. "No, Naomi, not for that, for rejecting you. Last night, her unforgiving heart played back to her like a film in reverse, along with the words, "I'll never forgive you." "Oh, I see. I forgive him. I totally forgive him. I do. And what about Marvin?" "Oh, you mean I have to marry him?" "No. I mean, what about forgiving him for not taking no for an answer?" "Oh, I do. I do forgive him. I know it's hard for him to let go." "See, when you're forgiven, it's easier to forgive, and your sins are forgiven, Naomi." The words began to sink deeply into the very depths of her being, to such an extent that she found she had the courage to ask the hardest question of all. Are you the word Abraham spoke?" "I am." "Oh, Yeshua, then." "Yes, my name." She knew he was alluding to her father's idea of the word as a salvation concept only. She wanted so much to ask him more about David Kaplan, the greatest Jew who had ever lived, until just now. But before she could speak her thoughts, he broke in. "Naomi, I love you." With those words, her heart totally melted. Like the wax candles in the Kiev menorah in the little Brooklyn home she shared with her father, from all she could tell in her comatose state, her closed eyes began to water, and salty tears streamed down her face. Time stood still as she wept. But she realized they were tears of joy. The silence continued. Perhaps he had left. "I think I'm crying. Are you still there? Did you leave me? Please don't leave me." "I'm here. I'll always be here, even when I'm not visiting you like this. Do you understand?" "Sort of. I think I do." She didn't have any theological basis for it within her deep one-God Jewish conviction, but somehow she knew that he was he. But she didn't feel the need to ask about something that was so obvious to her now. She hesitated, and then laughed to herself as she addressed him by name for the first time. "Yeshua, I love your words in that sermon on that mountain that my friend, a friend of mine. Hey, I never thought I'd get a chance to tell you how much I liked it in person. I told my father I did, but not you. Anyway, that my friend Darren read to me. You know, Darren Brock. Oh, what's the use? You already know him and how much I love him, but he's gone. And he's found someone else, someone who loves him, so I'm not going to ask. Anyway, maybe I could ask you something else, if you don't mind. Could you heal me like you... I realized you healed my father. Maybe that will come along with another gift. I'm going to leave you now, but I'm not really leaving. My spirit will remain. Be strong, Naomi, and trust in me. Everything will work out." I will. I love you. I don't mean as the other. No, you're one of us. I see that now. She smiled to herself, although her comatose lips remained unchanged. "And I guess also, I'm one of yours." All at once, his face drew closer and closer, increasingly covered by a newly formed shadow as it did. He reached all the way to her upper forehead and kissed it on the bandage exactly where her father had. Then he withdrew into the light, which quickly diminished as if it had been swallowed up by a black hole, and the pitch black returned. But she didn't ask what color it was. It didn't matter anymore. Chapter 44. Darren Brock was on the line with the Maimonides Medical Center Patient Information Center. At just about the same time, a nurse came into Naomi's room, which in turn was right after her divine visitor left, taking the brilliant light with him. However, the nurse wouldn't have noticed that. What she did end up noticing were Naomi's vital signs, which were at least somewhat improved over her morning readings. She was able to contact the doctor right away, who, among other things, upgraded Naomi's visiting status to include close friends, although the 5-minute time restriction remained. So when Darren asked about visiting that night, he was given a clearly affirmative answer. All afternoon he tried to prepare himself for what he would see. Naomi had appeared on the verge of death when he called 911 at the Goldbergs' house. He was aware that she'd improved, but he understood that she was still in danger, and he knew she was still in an induced coma. Just that fact alone broke his heart. Watching her in that state would be extremely painful for him, but she had visited him when he was in a coma the year before, so he could do no less for her. Of course, unlike those visits, he would avoid any reading of Scripture, discussion of God, or prayer. After all, she had ended her relationship with him as a result of her father's stroke and her conviction that by going with Darren, she had broken his observant Jewish heart. After work, he decided to take the cruiser to the hospital. As he got out of the car to walk toward the massive complex, he realized that he probably looked like any other visitor, although perhaps a visitor on official business. He always felt that way because, as a detective, he usually was on official business. But he knew his business in this case was also personal, more personal than even he wanted to admit. For that reason, to try to remain in his professional role, he would visit her for only the allotted 5 minutes and then head home to a waiting dinner with his parents Lester and Velma in Teaneck. At least he would be safer driving home in the cruiser late at night than if he was in an unmarked car, considering the dangers that remained. It was sort of like having Margaret as a police escort without Margaret having to be there. He followed the familiar signs to the intensive care unit, room 5. When he arrived, a nurse met him at the door. "How is she? And you are?" He pulled his police rank strategy to get the information he wanted. "Detective Darren Brock, NYPD. I was part of the life-saving team." With that information, the nurse could disclose information. "I see. Well, believe it or not, she's doing a little better than this morning. The doctor says if things continue like this, she won't have to be intubated again, which is good news. And a recent CT scan shows that the cranial blood is definitely being absorbed, slowly. Also, any kind of permanent paralysis is out of the question now. That is very good news as well. But the doctors feel she's by no means out of the woods, so we're asking for just 5-minute visits. Okay? Yes, of course. You may go in. She's not able to respond as she's still in an induced coma. That's a good thing at this point. She needs rest." "I understand." Darren walked slowly into the room. Immediately he could sense the presence of something, and that something felt positive. At least that was a good sign. He walked up to Naomi and almost had to look away. Her eyes seemed sunken and swollen at the same time. Her breathing wasn't exactly labored, but it wasn't steady either. The bandages on her scalp were thin enough to reveal what looked like burned flesh and missing hair underneath. And of course she was catheterized with the bag of urine at Darren's side of the bed. One arm and one leg were in a full cast, and he knew there was a question about her future walking ability. But the nurse had told him there was some improvement since that morning, and visitation had been widened. All of these were hopeful signs. In spite of her appearance, his love for her was as great as ever, even greater now that he saw her in this helpless state. And then there was that presence. He knew he had just a few minutes, so he might as well let her know he was there. He spoke in a low tone, almost afraid in some irrational way that he would wake her up. Darren, you're really here. Wait, don't leave. Darren, I just want to tell you that everyone's pitching for you. Chaya Mendel told me to say hello. Well, with all those children of hers, she can't get over here just yet. But she told me she's saying prayers for you. Well, I don't know what more to say. She thought she could hear him beginning to cry. He sniffled. "Oh, brother." Then he sighed deeply and paused before ending his very short visit. "Listen, I'm going to leave now." "No, Darren. No, I saw him, Darren. Don't leave. He talked to me, right to me. Please don't go. Please. Move, stupid body. Don't let him leave, you useless, worthless body. Help me, God, Yeshua, help. Darren arose from a bowing position and looked intently at Naomi's face. "Lord, the nurse said Naomi isn't out of the woods. Please, will you bring her through this? Please?" Her sunken, swollen eyes and unsteady breathing seemed to weigh his prayers down and drag them from the ceiling to the floor. A doubting, dire expectation mingled with his aching heart as he spoke directly to her. "I know you can't hear me, so before I leave, maybe for the last time, if you don't make it, which some people wonder if you will, I'll just tell you that I love you deeply and madly, Naomi Kaplan. I know I will learn to love Margaret and be a dutiful husband, but learning came easy with you, Naomi, and I so wish things had turned out differently. but they didn't. Still, the truth I will never share with anyone ever again is that as of right now, you are the love of my life. I know that's wrong, what with my engagement, but I believe God will forgive me, and I'll move on. And I do respect your wishes as a traditional Jew and your love for your father. But still, right now, it hurts deep inside. That's why I have to leave now and not come back. But I just had to say it. Just then, the dam broke loose. He began to weep and fell to his knees. Then he began to pound the side of the bed. God, help me, help me, help me not feel this way. The nurse came rushing in. Sir, I'm sure you're concerned for her, but perhaps you should go somewhere and compose yourself. He stood up and sighed deeply. Don't make him leave, stupid nurse. Please, don't. I'm sorry. I'll be all right now. Please just give me 30 seconds and I'll leave. Okay, but she needs rest, not agitation. Do you understand? I understand. Buddy, if you don't do something now, anything, he will leave and I'll never see him again. It's now or never. Darren took one last long look. He turned around to leave, intentionally keeping her in the corner of his eye. Just then, he thought he saw her left eye twitch slightly, but like an imaginary wink from a master's portrait painting, he paid no attention to it. Then, almost imperceptibly, the other eye seemed to twitch. That was enough to encourage him to turn toward Naomi and then to come close to her. Naomi? Naomi? She finally worked up enough strength to raise both eyebrows slightly. Naomi! The mouth was next. She had to tell him what happened to her. That was harder. She hadn't said a word since the explosion, and she was highly medicated. But Darren made things easier. He turned around to make sure no one was watching, and then came close and put his lips against hers. He kissed her full and deep, his tears softening both of their lips in the process. That did it. The induced coma didn't have a chance. One of her eyes fluttered open, and then the other. He felt them with his eyelashes and pulled back. You're awake. They'll kill me. They want your brain to rest. Her tongue wasn't exactly loosed, but it did start to wiggle a bit against her teeth. And she had her breath. Yes, you should, I know, I'm sorry. I should never have read those things to you. We come from different backgrounds, and I'm so sorry about all you've been through with your father. At least he's better. No! You were right. It's best the way it is. I will marry Margaret. She's a good woman. You'll find the right one for you. Now you should rest that pretty brain of yours. Doctor's orders, and I'll be going. What? Suddenly her tongue was loosed. Stop, Darren. You're being an ass. He couldn't help but giggle. What? Stop and listen. I saw. You saw what? I saw him. You saw who? Yeshua, you goose. I saw him. He talked to me. It's true. It's all true. And she ran out of breath and closed her eyes. She had to rest a minute. It was all too exhausting for her. He thought perhaps she was sinking back into a coma just as she was getting to what sounded like the good part. Naomi, are you still conscious? She popped her eyes open. Of course, you idiot. He didn't realize that name-calling was at least partly the result of impulsivity related to her quickly healing brain injury and partly the result of overwhelming joy. He's wonderful, and he told me my healing would come with a gift. And you know what? I realize now, you're the gift. But her neurologically impulsive behavior was beginning to work in her favor. I heard everything you said, Darren. Everything. You have a pretty big mouth. I'm the love of your life. You love me madly and deeply, and so much it hurts deep inside. Every word. So I'm here to heal your pain like you're here to heal mine. And Yeshua is here to heal us both. So his eyes widened. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Still, wasn't this too good? Didn't he have to think like a responsible adult, responsible to others beyond himself? But what about everyone else, Naomi? We have to take other people into account. We can't just think of ourselves. She was getting bolder as her voice got stronger. Yes, Darren Brock, but you know what? In this case, I think we can. And like who, Darren? Who do we have to think about? God will take care of my father. He always has. I was so stupid not to see that. And he'll take care of Margaret. She'll marry someone who really loves her. So? She had been gaining strength by the second. Now she pulled herself up to such an extent that the buzzer went off and the nurse headed toward the room. She had limited time. So marry me, Darren Brock, and love me like Yeshua does. You are also the love of my life, you know. Don't forget about me. He began by kissing her upper forehead, where the bandage covered her scalp, right where her father and Yeshua had kissed her. And just as he returned to her mouth, the nurse arrived. She pulled him off her with the strength of a trained health worker. Just what are you intending to do to her, sir? I'm going to call security right now. I'm going to marry her. That's what I'm going to do. Just as the nurse reached for the call button, Naomi shocked her to her toes with her own one-word answer. Yep. Chapter 45. Lawrence Schmidt was standing before his small team of investigators in an undisclosed location on the third floor of one of the more generic office buildings that dot Midtown Manhattan. Like a stoplight, his face had been turning periodically red as he lectured and lambasted. His audience, on the other hand, was exhibiting various expressions of uncomfortable body language, from the head-in-hand kind to the pencil eraser chewing variety. He was presently back in the crescendo side of his performance. The only reason heads aren't rolling here is because mine is the one that's on the chopping block. Among other skilled personnel, I rely on you to provide me with up-to-date human and electronic intel so that I can give my best performance to the NYPD, the FBI, the CIA, and every other bureaucratic behemoth that depends on the HS. And guess what? His face reddened more. You failed. You've all failed. You failed yourselves, me, and all of New York, not to mention our whole nation. You all better be thankful this idiot blew himself up in some rabbi's 2-bit Brooklyn brownstone instead of a crowded Manhattan landmark, and that the bomb he had strapped to him pretty much, well, bombed. What in this insane world happened that you missed this? All I can tell you is you better find out so it doesn't happen again. And I want to know who he answered to, if anyone. We should have uncovered any information a long time ago, including the lone wolf kind. Instead, we interrogated him 10 times and nothing. I walked into some of those with information you provided, and now I've got morons investigating me for incompetence. Unbelievable! A skinny, curly-headed, eager young man sitting right in front of Schmidt had been waiting for just this moment. He was a high-tech security expert whose gift had yet to shine, but it was about to. He had dedicated hundreds of hours since the explosion, and this was the time to reveal what he'd found to his only partially aware fellow agents. He had held back key findings until now, which he wouldn't have done if he thought present danger was still imminent. But the time was now ripe. He raised his hand halfway up, as if he were concerned it might be shot down if it rose any higher, which often happened, since he usually asked more questions than the others. Schmidt took note of the hand. Make it quick. I'm not finished. Sir, I've been working on something for the last few weeks, and... Yes? Well, I've been doing some detailed forensics on Shahedulah's phone, and I've been analyzing it. I've detected something quite surprising. He paused theatrically, as he knew he had everyone's attention, especially Lawrence Schmidt's. Then he continued, It seems the phone has been the recipient of what could only have been very sophisticated Russian technology. Schmidt couldn't help but interject. Russian? Yes, sir. It seems, if I have diagnosed things properly, that they have targeted his phone for hacks, even more sophisticated than the ones we've been familiar with. In fact, it's been challenging keeping up with them, but this is what I've uncovered. Go on, Chris, and don't take so long. Well, they seem to have been able to break into his apparently highly secure phone real time. The only way I can describe it is by referencing those old 1950s sci-fi movies where the aliens break into the TV signals in the middle of broadcasts to speak to viewers. So the point is, they seem to have been able to break into his phone usage at any time to give him direction, threaten him, and also listen to his calls, including those he talked to. And of course, they could text him at any time or view all of his texts. Are you sure? Yes, I'm sure, he shot back confidently. There's an apparently old text I've intercepted from maybe a few months ago or more. Forget the Flatiron Building. The Flatiron Building? Sorry, go on. Go only where we tell you to go. Follow Brock when we tell you to. Brock! Schmidt couldn't help but recall Darren Brock's warnings, not only about Omar himself, but also about Russian involvement in this whole mess. It only served to sour his mood further. Why are you stalling, Cress? Continue. Because you keep... Never mind. You'll never live to honor Allah with any infidel deaths if you don't do exactly what we tell you to. If you don't, We'll just kill you now before you kill anyone." He paused again.
And?
"Well, here's another one. We have Mahmoud's body, whom you murdered. It's preserved for evidence. We will make sure you go to American jail for life like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. At the next corner, get in car. We will hide you. Then you kill Darren Brock for us. This time you succeed. Next corner."
Well, that answers that mystery. I guess that Stanley fellow will want to know that.
"Well, I don't know who Stanley is or who Mahmoud is or was, but that's it. I'm working on other texts and even possibly some voicemails. The other live voice transmissions are gone, of course. We do also have records of calls from Pakistan, but no content." A fellow agent jumped in. "You know, we could help you if you just communicate with us." Bill Kress nodded. "Well, either way, I'm sure there are promotions for all of us, including you, Mr. Schmidt."
Lawrence Schmidt barked back. "Oh, shut up. I'm not thinking of that right now. Unbelievable. The Russians seem to be using him to shield their identity, like a parasite uses a host. We're nowhere near done with this. But good job, Kress. Listen to me. Follow the Pakistan lead and keep working on the phone forensics. I'll get a hold of Ralph Lewis and the NYPD, and this guy Brock, of course, and work together to get this done quickly before the Russians do something else, let alone Shahedullah's Muslim radical contacts in Pakistan. Unbelievable!"
As the meeting drew to a close, an oblivious Darren Brock was driving back to his parents' Lester and Velma's house in Teaneck, New Jersey. He crossed the George Washington Bridge and entered the state of New Jersey. He was in a particularly positive mood, more positive than he'd been since before Naomi broke up with him months earlier, and he was looking forward to sharing some very good news with his parents. When he finally entered the house on West Forest Avenue, there were Lester and Velma, waiting for him in their living room chairs. Velma seemed to take less notice of him than ever. She stared straight forward, and he had a harder time thinking he detected any visual or cerebral response. Perhaps he had been kidding himself about her attentiveness over the last year, but now he couldn't kid himself any longer. Lester smiled from his chair. He didn't get up. "How are you, son?" Darren smiled broadly. "Dad, I can't tell you how well I'm doing. A miracle has occurred with Naomi, like the miracle you witnessed with me last year. She woke up even from an induced coma, and she's getting better even as we speak. I'm sorry I haven't told you before, but I've been so busy. I'm in love with her, Dad, and she's in love with me. We're going to get married." "And her faith? And her father's faith?" Darren did something he rarely did. He got down on his knees in front of his father's chair and took his right hand. Tears filled his eyes. "Dad, you won't believe it. Naomi saw a vision. No, that's wrong. It wasn't a vision. Jesus visited her. He spoke to her, Dad. She responded, and now he's healed her, or he's healing her." Lester nodded. "I knew this thing might occur, but maybe not this soon. I've always seen something in Naomi's heart, an open heart for the Father, like her heart for her own father. I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for her. I'm thankful for you." But Darren could see a shadow pass over his father's face. He knew there was something concerning him. "What is it? Well, what about Margaret? Have you told her?" "Well, not yet. I'm not quite sure how to do that." "Well, do it wisely. You mean so much to her, perhaps too much. She is not mature in her faith, and her heart is vulnerable. Do it wisely. But do it, and do it soon. Don't delay. Don't let her hear it from someone else." Darren appreciated these admonitions from his father. He wished his mother could weigh in, but now he couldn't even look for a visual assent. He knew Lester was right, and he was just about to respond in agreement when his phone vibrated. He didn't want to answer it, but something told him he should at least look at the phone. He reached into his light fall jacket pocket and took it out. It was Inspector Ralph Lewis. "Yes, Inspector?"
"Get in here now, Brock. It's important."
"But I'm in Teaneck with my parents, and we haven't eaten."
"So eat fast and then come in, say within the hour. And watch yourself. Keep an eye out for anyone tailing you. I'll fill you in when you get here."
"Okay." Darren put the phone in his pocket and turned to his father. "I'll help you get Mom to the table for dinner. I guess it's about done. I can smell it. It smells good." "Yes, we're about ready. It's in the oven." "Right. I have to eat quickly and then go into the office. I don't know what it's about, but Inspector Lewis wants to see me." Lester got up, and together they assisted with Velma. Darren could tell she wasn't helping as much as she had been, but he thought he detected at least some cooperation as they each took a side. Chapter 46. Darren's detective's instincts had slowly begun to resharpen since the turnaround with Naomi. He recognized that a certain passive sloppiness had crept into his work over the last several months, resulting in a diminishing of his well-trained, observant eye. Along with that realization came a sudden remorse for his entire life attitude since the breakup. His conscience was roused from its dormant state as if a numbing anesthetic had worn off. He was ashamed and embarrassed. His father had warned him about this pouting schoolboy response to something he couldn't obtain, but he hadn't listened to him. Now that the most important treasure in his life, next to God, had been returned to him, he was face to face with his own immaturity, an immaturity that had actually existed through his entire adolescent and adult years. As he drove out of the Lincoln Tunnel and into Manhattan, that reality began to hit him as well. Perhaps it was even the reason for the fact that he had never found a healthy dating relationship with the opposite sex during his Christian high school and criminal justice college years, let alone a spouse. Why hadn't he addressed these issues earlier? He found himself confessing out loud to God as he drove toward the Midtown South precinct station on 35th Street. Please, I'm so sorry. I've been a jackass, God, a total jerk, a spoiled brat. I don't deserve Naomi. How can I be the husband she needs me to be when I acted like such an idiot? And oh my goodness, I've also sinned against Margaret. She may have come off as desperate and strong, but I've caused her to stumble by encouraging her when I knew I wasn't helping her. I was hurting her and her newfound relationship with God. What's the matter with me? Please forgive me. As he confessed, his eyes continued to sharpen, and the mist of oblivious inattentiveness cleared further. He suddenly became aware that he was being tailed by a black, late-model Honda Accord as he drove up 9th Avenue in the late evening illumination of street lights and headlights. His heart began to thump in his chest. Would shots rip through his body next? As they did the previous year, he chose his secure cell phone over the police radio and dialed headquarters. Of all people, Margaret answered. Margaret, listen to me. I'm almost at the station. I'm being tailed, maybe by Russians. Tell Inspector Lewis to post an armed detail outside, near my parking space and up to the building. Oh, okay. Be careful. Margaret was obviously flustered. She didn't want to lose someone she didn't realize she'd already lost. While talking to her, Darren had been glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the man in the front passenger seat of the tailing car. He was listening on his own cell phone, and then, right after Darren stopped talking to Margaret, the man turned to the driver and then back again. Could he actually be listening to Darren? How could that be possible? The Honda took a sudden turn onto 33rd Street and was gone. Darren took a deep breath and finally arrived at the precinct station. As soon as he got out of the car, 4 policemen surrounded him, guns drawn, and escorted him into the building. When he got to the second floor, Lawrence Schmidt and Ralph Lewis were waiting for him. Lewis was leaning back in his swivel chair with his feet up on his desk, as Schmidt was sitting on the front of the same desk with his feet dangling over the side. Lewis motioned for Darren to sit a foot or so from Schmidt in his usual lower seat, with Lawrence towering over him. The only consolation was that Margaret wasn't in the room. Larry, tell him what you found. Schmidt proceeded to tell Darren about the discovery of Russian texts on Omar's cell phone, as well as evidence of them breaking into the phone's voice signal. After he finished, Darren realized why he was in the low seat, with Ralph Lewis's feet up on the desk and Lawrence Schmidt sitting there towering over him. The configuration minimized the chances of him saying, "I told you so," but he didn't have to. He had other possible evidence to discuss. I was watching the tail car in the rearview mirror when I called in, and I swore the guy riding shotgun was listening to me on his phone. At least it seemed that way. Schmidt jumped off the desk and almost stepped on Darren's toes. He walked behind the desk and stood next to Lewis with an air of investigatory confidence. With what we know now, that could very well be. We'll look into it. Ralph, put a protective detail on Brock, a serious one. Lewis leaned forward and looked up at Schmidt with an even greater confidence. You don't have to tell me that. We know what we're doing here. Darren wasn't finished. He was back in action as a detective, and his tone of authority even exceeded theirs. Also, after they took shots at me at the Mendel house, 2 men dressed as Hasids ransacked the upstairs master bedroom. We need to find out who they are. The inspector jumped in immediately. We will. You just do what we tell you, so you don't get killed. Stay with the detail. Don't go to the bathroom without them. Now get out of here. I gotta get some sleep. That ended the meeting. 2 police cars escorted Darren to Teaneck with sirens off. They returned in the morning to escort him to work. and from there they escorted him to the Maimonides Medical Center to visit Naomi. He parked in a handicapped space with 2 cop cars following him there, and then they walked him to the main entrance. He wanted to tell them that wasn't necessary, but Inspector Lewis had told him to cooperate with the program for his own safety. Besides, he was too busy preparing his heart for the visit with Naomi to complain. Fortunately, they didn't follow him up the elevator and into the intensive care unit. He prayed under his breath the whole time. When he entered the room, she was sitting up in her bed, with fewer bandages covering her scalp and a healthy rosy color in her cheeks. She responded to his surprise entrance with a broad, sunny smile. "Darren, I get my own room today, and I may get released in the next few days. I told them my heart, everything is." He prepared to hear a new diagnosis: fibrillation, infection from her skin grafts, to which calcium alginate dressing had recently been applied to promote healing. "It's so full." Large round tears spilled from her eyes, down her cheeks, and onto her neck brace, like the overflow of King David's cup that runneth over. "I love you so much, and I love, you know." She mouthed the next word without any sound at all, not even a breath. He began his response with carefully rehearsed words. Naomi, I understand more about God's love today than I did last year. Since then, He has helped me to see just how ungrateful I could be, how childish and selfish. I'm ready to love a woman now more selflessly than I could last year. I'm ready to love you. I know it sounds like I'm reciting my wedding vows before the wedding, but, Darren, I never saw a man as selfless as you were last year. That's the man I fell in love with at first sight. When you made that long line of returns customers at Macy's wait while I went to the bathroom. Her face lit up fully as she giggled like a little girl. I guess if I was catheterized then like I was yesterday, we wouldn't be in love today. She giggled again, and he joined her. Then he responded to her mouthed word. He knew she was concerned with keeping her secret from her father, even if he was nowhere near enough to the hospital to hear her pronounce the name Yeshua. Naomi, my heart is full too. It seems like God is watching over us and has some wonderful plans for us. I believe those plans include the deep love for Israel, the land, and Israel, the people that we both have. But I also know how deeply you love your father and how hurt he will be when he finds out that you believe. But, my guess is that you haven't told him. We both know you need to. Somehow, some way, he needs to know before he hears it from someone else. Naomi paused, then she nodded. I know. I think maybe I want you with me. Maybe, Darren, can I ask you something? He nodded as he dabbed her cheeks with a tissue. I was just wondering, did you tell Margaret yet? No, but there's something else. I don't want you to worry, but things aren't over with me. She pulled his hand away from her cheek and sat up straighter. What do you mean it's not over? Are you giving me a reason to be jealous? Please don't tell me you're still in love with... He cupped her cheeks with his hands. No. I mean, I'm being followed by Russians. It's not over with them. We've discovered a number of things, including, believe it or not, Russian connections with Omar. We need to crack this thing once and for all so we can both be safe. I've been so busy with that I haven't had time to talk to Margaret yet. But I will. He saw the worried look in her eyes and sought to comfort her. God will protect us. He will. His face drew near hers as he sat on the bed, and their lips touched. Then he pressed them to his and gave her the longest and most passionate kiss yet, purging both of their lips from any leftover memory of Margaret and Dr. Martin Cohen. All she could say when he was finished was, I'm home. He had no idea how she had strayed from that home with Dr. Martin Cohen, DDS, and he didn't need to know. He stayed another half hour. They didn't kiss again, but his right hand held her left hand like teenagers on their first date, and then he left to go into work, followed by the detail that was waiting at the main entrance to take him to his car. Not 2 minutes after he left, her sister Lisa walked in with Lindsay and Noah. She was smiling wryly, and Noah revealed the reason, accompanied by a few short jumps. We just saw Darren in the hall. Lindsay played it down. So? Lisa raised her eyebrows. Wow, I heard you were doing better, but you really look good. Much better than the last time I was here. What, a few days ago? You're awake and sitting up, and see, they even let kids visit. And was he just visiting you? He was, wasn't he? What was that all about? Naomi rolled her drying eyes benignly. Questions. You're back together again. What do you think? Anyway, you were right months ago, and we're more in love than ever. I told you, I'm so happy for you. And Margaret? Lindsay and Noah were listening carefully. Noah wasn't even fidgeting. Naomi looked their way. Lindsay, Noah, can you keep a secret? Noah answered right away. No, not really. Lindsay poked her brother's shoulder. Shut up. Yes, we can. Noah got the point of the poke. Okay. For some reason, Naomi was in the secret revealing mood. Maybe it was related to her healing brain. Perhaps something within its recovering gray folds itched and needed one or more secret revealing scratches. Or maybe it was just concussive impulsivity, the kind that likes to blurt out, "Did you hear?" Whatever it was, she chose to trust Lindsay and Noah's word. After all, they were getting older every day. Well, he hasn't told Margaret it's over yet, but he will, and soon. Lindsay expressed tragic romantic empathy on Margaret's behalf. That's so sad. Lisa chose Lindsay's response as a teachable moment. Well, honey, sometimes what hurts at first is for the best later. When you grow up, there may be times you'll have to end a relationship, or maybe the boy will have to. If it's not the right one, it's better for it to end sooner rather than later. That is, after marriage. Noah had a less teachable response. I'm glad Darren's ditching her. Too much blonde hair between them. Naomi shook her head and smiled. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, Noah. Just don't say anything to anyone until Darren tells her, okay? He nodded. Lisa refocused on Darren. So, what about Darren's faith? Not that I'm suggesting you don't see him or anything. You know I was never for that, Naomi. I told you not to break up with him, and you didn't listen to me. But I'm just curious how you plan to deal with that. After all, you were so concerned about Dad's stroke having something to do with it. Not that it did, but you got it into your head that it did. Naomi's brain folds were still itching and in need of a good scratch. Well, can you all keep another secret? And really keep this one? Noah acted exasperated. Oh, no, not another one. Promise? Lindsay and Noah responded at once. Yes, promise. Lisa? Of course. Naomi lowered her voice, although not as low as she had with Darren. Well, I had an experience while I was in the coma. Lisa's interest was piqued. What kind of experience? She got quieter. I saw him. He talked to me. Who talked to you? I can't bring myself to say his English name, only his Hebrew one, but it was him. And he told me my sins were forgiven. What? You're crazy! You're talking about Jesus Christ, for God's sake. Well, if you put it that way, it was the medication. Your hidden love for Darren. Dead brain cells. Sorry, but Noah's interest was piqued too. Naomi's a Jews for Jesus. Can I tell Grandpa? Now it was Naomi and Lisa who responded at once. No! Lindsay was visibly disturbed. That's creepy, Aunt Naomi, like a visitor from beyond the grave in a horror movie. I don't want to tell anyone. I don't want any of my friends to know. Naomi had always loved her niece, but now she looked at her with a new level of compassion. I understand how you feel, Lindsay, but I don't feel creepy. I don't. I feel love, the God of Israel kind of love. I think you'll understand a little more later. Lisa jumped in, trying not to sound defensive. She didn't want to be argumentative with her recovering sister. She intentionally chose a smile. No offense, Naomi, but please don't preach to my children. Remember, they're Jewish. I wasn't really, and I know that. I'm Jewish too, but I understand how you feel. I was only trying to comfort Lindsay. Lisa took a deep breath. It's okay, Naomi. You're getting better. That's what counts. And I'm still all for Darren. When you're all better, maybe you'll see this in a different light, a clearer light, the light Dad taught you about. And you'll be the same Orthodox sister this Reformed girl knows and loves. And I do love you. Naomi wasn't in the mood to argue either. Of course, I'll still be Orthodox. And I love you, too. Well, we should go now so you can get some rest. Not a word, kids, right? Right, they responded. After a short hug with each one, Naomi was left alone. Why did she have to tell them? What possessed her? Well, one thing was for sure. This wouldn't be the last time she elicited a startled and skeptical response from others. Chapter 47. Darren felt like the President of the United States, and he didn't like it. He had his own Secret Service, and he couldn't shake them. But he had to admit, since he had his own security detail, no cars had tailed him. And since Ralph Lewis had also declared buses and subways off limits and restricted his cell phone use, Darren felt relatively safe, but not completely safe. Then again, who is, he thought, as he pulled into the NYPD Midtown Manhattan South Precinct Station. His armed guards escorted him inside and up to the second floor. Margaret greeted him as he was headed for his cubicle. He noticed that her hair was different. It was stylishly shorter and swept across her forehead in a gentle, breezy wave. Her eyelashes were longer, and the mascara around her eyes accentuated their extraordinary beauty. Her lipstick was a glossy and slick pink, and her cheeks were more rosy than he remembered. She seemed to wear her standard-issue police uniform better than he'd ever seen. Had she lost weight? She came close enough to touch his nose. Hi. Ralph Lewis appeared from somewhere beyond them.
Brock, Margaret will ride with you. You need someone inside your car and not just outside.
But
She'll accompany you home every night and then ride back with the detail.
I don't think I need...
You know, Brock, I don't think you know what you need. Leave that to us. We'll have this thing cracked soon, and then you can play tennis with the leader of MS-13 for all I care. For some reason, Russians want you dead, or worse. And as long as that's the case, we need to make sure you stay alive.
Darren gave up. Yes, sir. He spent the rest of the day trying to ignore several obvious advances by Margaret, while at the same time dispatching his various desk work responsibilities. The most obvious example consisted of her standing in front of him while he was seated, with her shirt unbuttoned to the third button. He couldn't wait for work to be over. When it was, he went from a portable hot plate into a closed oven in the form of his cruiser. As soon as they were on the road and headed for Teaneck, Margaret grabbed his steering hand and squeezed it. I've been thinking about you constantly, thinking about you and me and our wedding night. He began to sweat, even though the car was by no means warm. He wanted to wipe the sweat off his forehead, but his right hand was trapped under hers, and his left hand was doing the steering. Margaret could sense unease. What's wrong? Darren felt as trapped as his hand. What do you mean? I mean, why didn't you tell me what happened with Naomi at the hospital? Margaret. Anger crept in, raising her volume even more. Don't Margaret me. I understand she's better now. Isn't that a good thing? I mean, do you still love me? That's what I want to know. Margaret, do you? Please. Margaret squeezed Darren's hand harder. You know, Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. He loved Rachel, but not Leah. Well, what about you? Who do you love? Anyway, if I'm not mistaken, people don't marry 2 women in the West since Jesus walked the earth. Am I right, Darren? Am I? Darren pulled his hand from under hers. The car swerved out of the lane and then back. Margaret, stop. Do you love me or not? That's what I want to know. Me and only me. Darren realized that this was no time to tell her the truth, or she just might be angry enough to grab his hand and destabilize the vehicle. Instead, he had to de-escalate the situation. Can we talk later? You're supposed to be on the job protecting me. Maybe we can go out to dinner somewhere in Manhattan tomorrow night after work. No, I want to talk right now. I worked so hard to look pretty for you today, and you didn't say anything. I noticed. Well, why didn't you say anything? Why? I think I know why. Your heart has already gone astray. You know, the Bible has a lot to say about that. Margaret, I'm not talking anymore until we've parked outside my house. She folded her arms and clenched her teeth for the rest of the drive. When they pulled up in front of the house, the other cars arrived and parked a half a block away so they wouldn't alarm his parents. They waited for him to get out and go into the house before one of them drove by and picked Margaret up. This was her last chance. Prove you love me. Kiss me like you've never kissed me before. I want you so bad it hurts all over. She tried to pull him to her side of the seat and straddle him. He resisted and pulled back to the driver's side. Stop, Margaret. Okay, I admit it. I love Naomi. I can't go through with this marriage. I was going to tell you, but I guess you figured it out. What? You rotten some Christian. You led me on real good. Oh, my God. I can't breathe. Oh, my. She began to scream and then wail. Her tears marred her perfect mascara job, which, mixed with the rouge on her cheeks, created the appearance of a grieving clown. Here's your stupid ring. She pulled it off her finger and threw it against the windshield. It bounced off and landed in Darren's lap. She continued to wail for a good minute. He forced himself to turn to her. By this time, she was spent and began to pout like a child as she looked fully into his eyes. He reached out and cupped one painted cheek. Compassion filled his soul like a warm, flowing salve. Margaret, listen to me. Listen to me. God won't leave you alone. In time, after you've grown a little stronger spiritually, he'll provide a godly man who will love you like he does. I absolutely know that. It's not me, and I should have realized that and told you a lot sooner. I've been weak and selfish, but I was hurting myself and hurting you. Please, Margaret, don't give up. Not on God and not on yourself. I'll be praying for you. You'll get through this. She cried some more and then sighed a deep sigh. Well, it was nice while it lasted. It really was. But I knew it wouldn't last. It never does. Never. Oh, well, the next time it will. How do you know? I know. Somehow I know. I need to go now. Okay, please pray for me, and pray I don't come on so strong. I was too forward, wasn't I? Wasn't I? Sometimes, Margaret, it's because you want a lasting relationship, but you'll have one anyway, even without trying so hard. You'll see. As he got out of the car and walked toward the house, he wondered how he could sound so confident when he had no evidence. One of the police cars drove up, and Margaret pulled out a tissue before she got in. At the exact moment the police detail pulled away and drove back toward Manhattan, Naomi lay in her hospital bed, whispering out plans, unaware that Darren had already completed his part of the bargain with her. I'll be first, before Darren. Abba will be here sometime tomorrow morning. I don't know how, but I'll tell him. I've got to tell him. I promise Darren. Please, God, don't let him have another stroke when I tell him. I know you can keep that from happening. After all, you healed him from the last one. It took her 2 more hours to drift to sleep, aided by a high dose of Tylenol. Her anxious thoughts morphed into an extreme anxiety dream, in which her father's face appeared before her. She opened her mouth to begin sharing her spiritual experience. As she watched his expression, it began to become more and more contorted. Within seconds, she realized something was blocking his trachea, and he couldn't breathe. He gagged, but she felt powerless to help him. Oh, if she only had been trained in the Heimlich maneuver. His face became redder and redder until finally his head exploded like a squeezed tomato, leaving nothing but a bloody stump of a neck and a gurgling sound. Her eyes popped open. Sweat was dripping down her face. Oh my, not this morning. I can't tell him this morning. She spent another few waking hours before sleeping another tentative few hours. After she was awakened by the nurse for vital signs, she slept again through breakfast. When she next awoke, the face in her nightmare appeared before her in the flesh. Abba, Baruch Hashem, you're healing so fast, my precious Naomi. God is with you. The doctor told me it won't be long before you can go home, and we can read the sages over dinner and on Shabbat. I miss you at home. You nursed me when I was sick. Now I will do the same for you until you're ready to go back to work. He reached over to the top of her head and stroked the curly patches of hair protruding from the gaps in the graft protection that still remained. She knew she should tell him everything that happened, but she still had visions of his head exploding like a squeezed tomato. She made an on-the-spot decision to at least tell him about Darren. Abba, I just want to tell you, Darren and I are seeing each other again. I just wanted you to know that. David Kaplan made every effort to keep every muscle on his face calm. He's a good man. But what about his policewoman friend? Well, I happen to know that's not going to work out. I see. Well, you know I've always taught you to love the other, but certain kinds of love would not work well for us as Jews. You understand me? Yes, I do, Abba. Was she now the other? The other. I understand. Still, I love him deeply and will always love him. And he will always love me when I get better. When that happens, we are going to... I understand. You don't have to tell me. We will talk about these things later. I will have something to give you then to help you remember who you are. Until that time, you're tired. I woke you up, and I'm tired. I didn't sleep well last night. He reached over and kissed her on her forehead. Then he slowly walked out of the room without looking back, feeling the Linotype legacy letter in the pocket of his black jacket. Naomi bit her lip. Then she prayed one short prayer. I hope you know what you're doing, Yeshua. Forgive me. I hope you know what you're doing. Chapter 48. As he and Darren waited for Inspector Ralph Lewis, Lawrence Schmidt was either agitated, anxious, or excited. Such was Darren's imprecise assessment. He studied Lawrence's round Hemingway face as they stood in Lewis's office. It had very few lines for a man in his early 50s, really none. Apparently, the dangerous world of terrorist activity didn't keep the Homeland Security agent up at night. Maybe that was a good thing. Who needs a nervous Homeland Security agent? His thick brush mustache was extremely well groomed, as was his thick, straight brown hair that covered his head, except for a typical small, bald spot in the back. He had no ring on his finger. He either was never married, was widowed, or was divorced. It turned out Schmidt was excited. As soon as Ralph entered the office, the Homeland Security agent clapped his hands together so loudly it sounded like a firecracker on the 4th of July.
Okay, I've got something. As you know, since we found a Russian connection with Omar Shahadullah, we've been working overtime with the NYPD at the Diamond District's crime scene for last year's Mandy Mendel murder.
He found himself out of breath and overwhelmed, trying to get all the revelations out. After a short pause and one inhale and exhale, he continued.
Boy, those vendors didn't like to talk about anything. It's like they're trying to hide the fact that they sell diamonds at all. Like they want us to think they sell kosher hot dogs from push carts or something. Every transaction, every import, and everyone else's import or export is nobody's business. I don't know if they've got a code tighter than the mafia or what. Anyway, we finally got one of those guys to talk about Mandy Mendel to an undercover cop posing as a Chabad Hasidic diamond merchant from Israel. With the accent, the outfit, the beard, the whole bit. Finally, and I mean finally, he started spilling about a street rumor he swears is true. From what he says, Mendel himself confided in him about it. The guy never told anyone. He was even uncomfortable with mentioning it to anyone after Mendel's death. Anyway, it seems Mendel was expecting, or had received, he doesn't know which, a shipment of diamonds rescued years ago from the Holocaust. They'd been hidden by a family in Crimea. The family perished in the camps. The diamonds were considered lost, particularly two very large, perfect diamonds, like maybe 20 carats each. They're so perfect that they're rumored to be worth like $30 million apiece. At least that's what the guy I talked to says. I have no information on the cuts, shapes, or anything like that. But apparently, these importers of rocks like that tend to hide them in crazy and unexpected places, often somewhere in their own houses, until they can export them to their next destination safely. Brock, the first thing I thought of was the two Hasidic men, or men dressed like Hasidic men, who ransacked Mendel's bedroom after the attempt on your life. They were definitely looking for something.
Inspector Lewis sat in his desk chair, leaning back and swiveling at the same time. He was sucking on the kind of cheap lollipop that banks keep on hand for fidgety children. He took the lollipop out of his mouth.
Brock, this is your investigation. You once complained to me that you were stuck with the remnants of the Italian mafia. Well, I put you on the Omar Shahadullah investigation. All you did at first was complain about that. But your instincts about Omar were right. Now I let you get involved with this Russian connection again. A connection that could rise as high as the Kremlin. But with their sophisticated technology, that's where we are right now. I don't want to hear your belly aching about this one. It seems like they might be looking for these diamonds. So I'm sending you over to the widow's house with a heavily armed detail. They won't dare expose themselves to a police firefight. And we want them to know we stand behind you. Interview her, check out the house, use every detective skill you've been trained in. We'll call her and let her know you're on your way. You want Margaret to ride shotgun?
No, I don't think so, Lawrence broke in.
I agree with Brock. I think she should stay here with me.
Lewis gave him a quizzical glance. Just then, Margaret knocked on the closed door. Lewis shouted,
"Who is it?"
She walked in and stood close to Lawrence Schmidt. Darren eyed them both intently. What was it about their body language? Was Margaret flirting? Was Schmidt? She put her hand on his shoulder, looked at him, and smiled. Darren thought, I've seen that before. So soon? I told her to give it time, to give herself a chance to grow spiritually. And besides, I can't believe the inspector is ignoring what she's doing. It's one thing for him to have looked the other way when Margaret did that with me. After all, it was convenient. He wanted me to get over Naomi. But Schmidt? Just then, Ralph Lewis, who was too focused to pay attention to the infraction, slapped his hand on the table. Okay, all of you, get going. Schmidt, get back to your office and dig up more information. He left first and began to walk through the outer office. Margaret left next, and Darren after her. Outside the inspector's office, she stopped him. He goes to a good church. He's believed since college, and I'm going to his church with him this Sunday. I love his cute, thick mustache, and I think I could love him, too. I hope he'll fall in love with me. We have a dinner date Friday night. I guess you were right when you said God won't leave me alone. Darren nodded. But it's a bit soon. She lowered her head and whispered, It may be my last chance, Darren. I'm almost 50. You have Naomi. He appreciated her honesty. She was never that honest with him. He lifted up her chin and looked into her eyes. One word of advice. She struggled to look directly at him. He detected the shame she was trying to conceal. Margaret, listen to me. Take it slow, very slow. Get to know him first without getting to know him, if you know what I mean. Leave a whole lot for the wedding, and invite me to the wedding, that is. She grinned and winked at him, and then proceeded to her cubicle. Ralph Lewis opened his door and stuck his head out. Get going, Brock. I just called Mendel's widow, and the detail is waiting for you outside. I'm going. He walked down to the first floor and out the door. One of the fresh-faced rookies was in the parking lot standing next to Darren's car. I'll drive us in my marked car. You can leave yours here, sir. Are you sure? Yes, sir. I think the inspector would want it that way. I don't know if he would or wouldn't. Do you know how to drive this thing? Yes, sir. Just kidding. I understand, sir. They both got in and drove off, with 3 marked cars escorting them as they traveled the half hour or so to Brooklyn via the Manhattan Bridge. Darren didn't feel like talking, so he let the rookie know. I'm going to get some rest. Let me know when we get there. He shut his eyes and leaned his head back. Then he prayed to himself. Oh, God, help me to ask the right questions and get the right answers. We've got to solve this case for Chaya's sake, as well as mine and everyone else's. And oh, please, keep us safe. He was actually glad he had a driver, because he did doze toward the end of the ride. He woke up just as the 3 escorting police cars pulled in front and behind the rookie's car. They all double parked in front of Chaya Mendel's house. The other policemen got out of their cars and put their hands on their holsters. With 2 cops per car, it looked like a drug bust. 2 neighbors opened their front doors and stared at them. Darren got out and walked up to Chaya's front door. The rookie stayed in the vehicle. Chaya let him in immediately. Then one of the cops asked a neighbor if he could use their bathroom while the others got back in their cars. Once inside Chaya's house, she asked him to sit on her pristine white couch while she sat in the dark red upholstered armchair adjacent to it. She was dressed in her usual long black skirt and white blouse. Her traditional Hasidic wig, or sheitel, was fastidiously styled. Darren looked around and asked a question he'd often asked before. Where's Natan? He's playing with the other children upstairs. It's better this way, and safer, notwithstanding the fact half of the NYPD is outside. Darren felt a big disappointment that the children were right upstairs, and yet the one who called him Abba and loved to jump on his lap wouldn't be spending time with him. But Chaya was right. That was not the purpose of this meeting. Earlier, her heart had jumped in her chest when the inspector had called and mentioned her late husband's name. Now she was trying to keep it from further jumping by starting with small talk. So, how's your fiancée? You mean Margaret, I suppose? Yes, she's a lovely woman and a good match, I think. Yes, she is, for someone. In fact, she's seeing a Homeland Security agent named Lawrence. Oh, really? I'm sorry it didn't work out. There was an awkward few seconds, after which Darren spoke up. I'm not sorry. I'm seeing Naomi Kaplan. Again, Chaya tried not to sound surprised or disappointed. Oh. There was more silence, which she broke this time. So which one is changing religions, or is neither one? Perhaps you should ask Naomi that. Perhaps I will. I do realize that you're fond of each other. I can understand that. You're both wonderful people, as well as good friends of mine. That won't change. But of course you realize there are other important factors. Another pause. However, we're not here to discuss that, so I understand you have some news about my late husband's murder. Darren was glad they were moving away from the last subject and getting down to the reason he was there. He needed to keep this professional and focused. He had spent enough time the year before trying to question Naomi about her brother-in-law Mark's possible mafia connections, only to be constantly distracted by his growing love for her. That was so unprofessional. A professional approach was important in this case. Chaya, we may have found some connections. to some diamond importers. I mean, I know your husband was in that business, but I'm referring to some specific imports. Did he ever discuss anything about some jewels retrieved from Eastern Europe, specifically recovered from someone or ones who hid them in the area of Crimea during the Holocaust? He never discussed his work with me, Detective Brock. She normally called him Darren. Did she call him Detective Brock because this was a different context than his visits with Natan? Or was it because she was distancing herself from him now that he was back with Orthodox Jewish Naomi? Maybe it wasn't that. She said they'd always be friends. She continued, "Our husbands never discussed their work with us, that is, especially their work in the diamond business. They make a living so we can follow Torah and serve God as a family. That was his work's purpose. My husband was a good man and was filled with good works, but some of those works he didn't share with me." "I see. Do you mind if I ask you something?" "Of course, Darren. You can ask me anything." He liked hearing his first name again, even though it was less professional. "Can we go up to your bedroom for a few minutes? I mean, I know it's your private quarters, but we feel there's a connection in all this with those two men dressed as Hasidic Jews who left that room in disarray. I know you've wondered about them." "Yes, you can examine the room, but I don't think you'll find anything. After all, something tells me that if they were pretenders, they didn't find whatever it was they were looking for." "That may be true, Chaya, but I'm a trained investigative detective. I just want to take a look." "Okay, I'll take you up there, but please be quiet. I don't want Natan to see you. He's playing with his brothers and sisters in a room down the hall." They walked upstairs and entered the Mendel's master bedroom. Chaya kissed the mezuzah on the door on the way in. All the rooms had them, not just the front door. Once inside, Darren was struck by how tidy it was and how sparse. Of course, he hadn't investigated the closet or the bureau drawers. There were two unassuming twin beds. Very few items were on the night tables. The most prominent of them was a white basin Mandy had used to wash his hands and face upon arising in the morning. Darren then looked across the room at the dresser. On top were two worn blue velvet bags. Darren went over and picked them up. "May I?" "Yes, I'm sure you know what those are." "Yes, I do. This one has the talit, the prayer shawl. Yes, we say talis in our community." "Right. And this one has the tefillin. The leather box is worn on the forehead and arm with scripture in them, scripture that directs one to wear them." "Very good." He zipped the bags open one at a time, feeling them for anything sewn into them, and quickly examined the contents. After he zipped the bags closed, Chaya shared more about them. "Those were the holiest items in Mandy's life. Those and his prayer book. That's downstairs, if you want to look at it. But these were even more holy. They were his father's, and his father's before him. His father brought them from Poland when he came early in the 20th century. Neither bag left his side in the morning. That is, rarely. The tefillin went in for repair a while back for only 2 days. He borrowed someone else's then. And he brought the talis with him to synagogue every Shabbat. Tefillin aren't used on Shabbat." "I see." He placed the bags back on the bureau. "Thank you for allowing me to handle them. I hope you don't mind my looking at some drawers that may have some unmentionables." She nodded. Then he proceeded to pull out every drawer and examine the bottoms, sides, tops, and insides of the bureaus and night tables for any unusual compartments or other hidden areas. He looked in the closet and checked the drapes for any unusual hidden areas. Then he turned to her. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but our Homeland Security contact, Margaret's new boyfriend?" "Yes, that's right. He told us that diamond merchants like your husband sometimes temporarily store things in unusual places, and possibly places close to home. Well, I'm finished here." She led him back downstairs. As he approached the front door, he turned to her, being careful not to touch her, which was forbidden for any man but her husband. "Well, we'll stay in touch. I know we'll get the answers you, and all of us, want. The police will continue to keep a protective eye on you and your family." "Thank you. You've always been so kind to us. To Natan, myself, all of us. Please give my regards to Inspector Lewis." "I will." With that, he left. The police exited their cars and escorted him to the car he came in, with hands on their holsters. One even had his gun drawn. They all got in their cars and drove down the street in close proximity to each other. As soon as the rookie rounded the corner, Darren's phone rang. There was no caller ID. He put it to his ear and listened. Someone with a clear Russian accent spoke.
We saw you, and we see you now. Don't play with us. We are always listening and always watching. Your investigations are nothing. We will investigate you and find all you are looking for. Don't bother tracing this call. You will not be able to.
The voice hung up. Even though he knew it was useless, he shouted the typical, "Hello, hello," and then mumbled to himself, "I'm so sick of those Russians." He turned to the rookie. "Take me back to the precinct headquarters." "That's where I'm going, sir." "Right, of course." He knew this whole mess wasn't over yet. That was for sure. He found himself once again praying for himself, Chaya, Naomi, everyone, even the policewoman, Margaret. Chapter 49. Darren sat on the edge of Naomi's hospital bed, holding up her toothbrush. "Don't forget your friend here." She smiled as she sat in a hospital-provided wheelchair, waiting for the nurse to come and release her. Darren then softly spoke words she had been waiting sleepless nights to hear. "I told her. She's already showing interest in a Homeland Security agent. You're the only one, Naomi. You always will be." Naomi responded thankfully, but also sheepishly. "Baruch Hashem, but I haven't told Abba about me." In God's time. She was making real progress walking, but she wasn't yet ready to navigate freely. The casts on her arm and leg were smaller now, but she still had a few weeks until they came off. And the same was true for her neck brace. A small blue silk scarf covered the still healing areas of her scalp, giving her the appearance of Tevye's wife, Golda, in Fiddler on the Roof. But with Darren by her side carrying her small suitcase, she felt more like one of their 5 daughters. The fact that one of the daughters married a Christian man didn't enter her mind. Finally, the nurse came. She asked Naomi to sign a form, gave her crutches to hold, and wheeled her out of the room. With Darren by her side, they passed an NYPD sentry in the hall, and he followed them down the elevator and out of the Maimonides Medical Center. There were 2 police cars waiting, and Darren's car as well. He placed Naomi in the passenger seat and then put crutches and suitcase in the back seat and got in the driver's seat. He drove her toward her Brooklyn brownstone, escorted by the 2 marked cars. When they arrived there, an anxious David Kaplan was watching them through the living room window. He hurried to the front door and opened it. Naomi waved at him from inside the car as she watched for Darren to get her suitcase and crutches out of the back seat. David went out to help with the suitcase. "My precious Naomi, welcome home." He leaned over and gave her a quick hug. "You're doing so well. You're more beautiful than ever. Hello, Darren. I'll help with the suitcase." "Hello, David." Darren gave him a hug and then gave him the suitcase. He assisted with Naomi and helped her adjust her crutches as she stood up. His experience helping his mother Belma gave him training in gentleness that matched his sweet personality, and it wasn't lost on Naomi. David Kaplan watched ambivalently as she gave Darren a quick kiss on the mouth. Then Darren and David slowly accompanied Naomi as she made her way toward the house. When they got inside, an NYPD policeman closed the door behind them and retreated to his car. Once inside, Darren escorted Naomi to a kitchen chair. "Is everything good?" "Everything's good, especially with my 2 favorite men here." David stood over her. "Can I get you something?" "No, Abba. I'm not hungry or thirsty. I just want to sit here for a few minutes and thank Hashem for bringing me to this season." David Kaplan thought, bringing her to the season of marrying a Christian, even a good Christian. But he held his tongue. She, on the other hand, had only gratefulness to the God of Israel. She quoted the Shehechianu prayer as her father mumbled it half-heartedly along with her. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given us life, sustained us, and enabled us to reach this season. She turned around and noticed an envelope with her name on it sitting on the kitchen table. "What's this, Abba?" "It's just a letter from me. I'd like you to read it now, if you would like to." "Of course, Abba." As she picked up the letter, he reached out and put his hand on hers. "As you read it, I want you to remember all the times you asked me questions and listened intently to my response. I'd like to think that this is one of those times." "Okay, I love those times. I did." "Well, I'll open it." She opened the letter and unfolded it. It looks like this was printed on a Linotype machine. That alone makes it special, Abba. Yes, it was. Then she read the letter. Both David and Darren could hear a nervous quaver in her voice. My dear and beloved daughter Naomi, as I type this on the Linotype machine where we sat together not long ago, you are lying in a coma after saving the lives of 3 young children. I can't tell you how full my heart is that you performed such a mitzvah. You obeyed Moshe, who told us to preserve life. I know you have an inquisitive mind and have asked many excellent questions worthy of the sages. No one has the answers to all those questions, but I want you to always ask them, like our father Abraham did when he stood before Hashem in the matter of his nephew Lot. Yet, as your loving father, whom I'm sure you will outlive by many years, I want you to always remember that the answers are in our Jewish tradition, even as you respect the faith tradition of the other, as I've always taught you. It's true that you may never have your own natural children, but in God's wisdom and God's way, you will carry the legacy of our forefathers into the future, even for your niece and nephew, and many other nameless Jewish children. That legacy includes the words of our great sage Maimonides, who said he believed with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, by which he meant our Messiah. By keeping our legacy, you will usher him in. Your loving Abba. Naomi looked at her father as tears filled his eyes. Then she looked at Darren's soft yet electric blue eyes. They seemed to say, "This would be a very good time, Naomi." Then she turned to her father again. Abba. She froze for several seconds and then jumped up. I think I have to go to the bathroom. She grabbed her crutches and walked slowly out of the kitchen and down the hall into the first-floor bathroom. David and Darren sat on the kitchen table in awkward silence. They could just hear Naomi, who was weeping softly. Finally, Darren broke the silence. Mr. Kaplan, while we wait for Naomi to come out of the bathroom, may I get your advice on something? David saw an opportunity to further explain the legacy letter to Darren, but as soon as Darren asked his question, the opportunity dissipated. I must ask for your confidentiality, because this relates to my work, specifically concerning the Mandy Mendel case. I believe you're familiar with that crime, and his widow, Chaya? Yes, a great tragedy. I'm sure you and your friends are working hard to solve it, if you haven't solved it already. We haven't. In fact, that's the reason I have police protection at the moment, including outside your house. I see. Darren hesitated and then shared the most sensitive information. At any rate, my question has to do with a certain shipment of precious jewels that Mandy may have stored or hidden somewhere before planning to export them. We have reason to believe that these belong to a family who perished in the Holocaust. I was told by dealers in the Diamond District that Hasidic Jews who act as importers and exporters sometimes store these items temporarily, often in unusual places, close to their person in some way. If you were Mandy Mendel, where do you think you would store such things? And I must tell you, before you answer, that certain Russians seem to be obsessed with his bedroom. Diamonds, I take it? Yes, 2 of them, big ones. David would rather have discussed the letter and Naomi's Jewish legacy, but Darren had asked about where Mandy Mendel would hide diamonds from the Holocaust, so he answered him. What is the most precious and holy item Mandy Mendel owns, even more precious than diamonds? The answer to that question was easy. Chaya Mendel had just shared that information with him. His talit and tefillin? But the bags have nothing sewn into them, and he wouldn't he? But it wouldn't be kosher, would it? I mean, the Holy Scripture is enclosed on holy parchment. They are to be used on the forehead and arm in accordance with Deuteronomy 6:8, and for no other purpose. I know that much. As you said, it's a very holy item. That's true, Darren. But if I were Mandy Mendel, I believe I might consider jewels, which belong to an entire family whose blood was shed in martyrdom for their faith after they hid the diamonds, to be quite holy, wouldn't you? You see, observant Jews can be quite flexible sometimes about some things. Darren paused as he looked down at his shoes. Then he lifted his head, and his eyes met David Kaplan's. Crazy. It reminds me of that movie, The Maltese Falcon. I never saw it. Oh, that's okay. It's not worth explaining. Let me ask you just one last thing. Something Chaya said got me thinking. She told me that the tefillin left Mandy's side just once recently for a repair that took a day or two. I believe he may have borrowed a friend's during that time. How often might tefillin that have not been damaged in a fire or the like be taken somewhere for repair? Never that I know of. I mean, if the leather straps are well wrapped, and they usually are, and they're stored in the velvet bag, often with caps over the boxes, why would they? I still have my grandfather's in mint condition, so to speak. Just then, a red-eyed Naomi hobbled into the room. She stood between Darren and David, faced her father, and began to speak. Her speaking pace was quick, and her heart was pounding, but her voice was clear. Abba, I have to tell you something. When I was in a coma, well, I know you'll say it's because I was in a coma, but this was different. Besides, I could hear everyone else who walked in the room, including you. David held up his palms to slow her down. Naomi, my daughter, you're not making any sense. She knew she had to tell him plainly. Okay, Abba. Everything was dark. It was blackness all the time while I was lying there. When you came in, when Darren came in, when Aunt Ida came in with a woman named Mahalia Morse, when others came in, I heard everyone, but I didn't see anything. But then she closed her eyes and concentrated, trying to remember what it was like. Then a light as bright as the sun filled the room, and a man came in. It was like he was on fire, like his eyes were on fire. He was so bright, but he wasn't like the burning bush. She opened her eyes. David Kaplan looked at her and reacted to the direction he perceived things might be going. Like an evil presence? No, Abba. No, he spoke in the kindest voice I've ever heard, almost like your kindness, but beyond any kindness in this world. He said, your sins are forgiven. He told me some other things, like when I would wake up from the coma and start to get better. And he showed me holes in his wrists. They were in his wrists, Abba, not in his hands. That's wrong. I know that. I know that for a fact. He showed me. I know it. And the love, wow, I can't describe it except it was God's love, the God of Israel. Tears began pouring from her eyes. She shut them and then tried to wipe them with her forefinger. When she opened them, she saw, through blurred vision, David Kaplan sitting on the chair, staring forward, ashen. At least 30 seconds passed, maybe a minute. Darren stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her. Finally she spoke, just above a whisper. Abba, say something. Do you still... Tell me you still love me. Please, Abba. His gaze stayed fixed forward. He spoke in a monotone. Of course I still love you, Naomi. How could I not love you? He turned to face her. I love you very much, but as the other now. You are now one of the others that I love, as I love myself. I love you like the little Gentile children with cancer that I visit as Santa Claus at Maimonides on December 25th. I love you, but as the other. A look of absolute and desperate horror appeared on Naomi's face, a look Darren had never seen and actually frightened him. Then she began to scream and wail so loudly that Darren was sure one of the policemen would rush the house. No, Abba, no, Abba, no, I'm not the other. Don't say that. Don't you dare say that. Please, don't. I'm not the other. I'm me. I'm your eldest daughter, Naomi Kaplan, who will carry on your Jewish legacy. I will. You'll see. I will. Won't I, Darren? Her face, which had grown as red as the blood that had rushed to her head, began to return to its original color. Darren spoke as quietly as he could. You will, Naomi, but perhaps we shouldn't keep talking about this now. Emotions are raw, hearts are broken. It's enough for now that love is being expressed. David turned to him. You're right, Darren. That is wise, like the sages. You're a good man. You are one of the best men I've ever met, Jew or Gentile. He stood up and shook Darren's hand. Then he went over to Naomi and kissed her on the forehead for a good 10 seconds. He looked into her totally bloodshot eyes. Darren is right. Remember that I still love you deeply. And yes, as your father, many children convert. But Daddy, I haven't. Shh. Be still. That's how it feels to me, Naomi. That's how it feels to me. Feelings don't just change to other feelings. This is the hardest news a Jewish father could hear, but we'll get through this one way or the other. Right now, we should both rest. After all, we both just recently recovered from very serious conditions. One of us is still in the early stages of recovery, as your crutches make clear. Let's just love each other and get along. God will take care of the rest. I'll take the legacy letter and throw it out. As he reached for it, she put her hand on his. No, Abba. I want it. I want to have it. As she took it, he nodded. It's yours if you want it. He got up and slowly walked out of the room. Darren turned to Naomi. Your father is a great man, a truly great man. She wiped more tears with her forefinger and nodded in agreement. He's one of two, and the other one is you. Well, he also gave me some incredible work advice, and that's why I need to leave right now and get over to Chaya Mendel's. I'm so sorry, my beloved Naomi, but it's urgent. Can I borrow your phone? Well, sure. Is yours broken? And sort of. Let's put it this way. It's broken into. She handed him her phone. He called Ralph Lewis. Inspector, it's Darren Brock. This is Naomi's phone. I've got a hunch. I'm headed back over to Chaya Mendel's. I need more backup than ever. Please call her and tell her to be careful. He gave the phone back to Naomi and then gave her a quick kiss and a hug. Then he walked out the front door. Chapter 50. The rookie was 3/4 to Chaya Mendel's house when Ralph Lewis called Darren on his phone. He was surprised that Lewis was calling on what was obviously a compromised phone that had been hacked using technology that might be traceable to the highest authority, the Kremlin. Inspector, this isn't safe.
Who the hell cares about that now? We've got our man in position across the street. There's been an intrusion. We're dealing with a hostage situation.
What?
You heard me. The whole Mendel family. The neighbors saw it happen. And you know these Russians.
Oh, no. This is obviously a very dangerous situation. I don't suppose I could ask you to pray for the Mendel family, Inspector.
You pray for them and yourself. I'll cross my fingers.
He hung up. Darren turned to the rookie. Park down the street. I'll walk from there. I'll be okay. These morons are too busy, too greedy to think of me just this minute. Anyway, I believe things are beyond that now. Yes, sir. Whatever you say. But I'll cover you. Thank you. You do that. Park here. As the rookie pulled up and parked, Darren got out and pulled out his gun. He arrived across the street and asked for a briefing from the detail posted there. What's up? They've been in phone contact. 3 of them, we think. They're holding the mother and the children at gunpoint. They're telling us they'll slaughter all of them in a hail of bullets if we make a move. They told us that way the deaths of the children will be painless. Such hearts. They also reminded us about Mandy Mendel, as if they had to. Oh, boy. Cover me. Where are you going? I'm going to the only place I must go. He walked down the street and then crossed it. The head of the police detail tried to catch his attention without attracting anyone else's. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Darren disappeared around the corner. The cop shook his head. How can we cover him if we can't even see him? Just then, Darren turned the corner again and walked back toward the house, clinging to the brick front of each house on the block. He climbed over each porch and stayed as close to each house as he could. When he got to the near side of the Mendel house, he closed his eyes and prayed to himself. Oh, I think I'm totally healed of that shotgun wound last year, but if I'm not, I'll certainly find out now. Please, God, cover me. He took a deep breath, put his gun in its holster, and then climbed up the right side of the first-floor window. His feet slipped once or twice, but finally he climbed onto the ledge above the window. He was thankful Brooklyn brownstones were built that way. He was now just to the right of the master bedroom window. He was also thankful that the curtains to that room weren't fully drawn. He could just see into it. One of the 3 Russians, who were all dressed as Hasidic Jews, in black with white shirts, sporting curly beards, seemed to be tasked with looking out the front window from time to time. He did it from an oblique angle to avoid being in the line of fire, but that angle also obscured Darren from him, which was another blessing. Darren could just see the other 2 training their guns on the Mendel family. One seemed to be aiming his gun right at Natan, which particularly disturbed Darren. But he was doubly thankful that the Russians' backs were to him and the family were facing him, hands in the air. That is, until Natan saw him through the window. Darren saw Natan mouth, Abba, and he was sure he'd spoken it out and that everything would be exposed. He shook his head no, even though it would have been too late if Natan had spoken. But it soon became apparent that Natan hadn't. He had merely mouthed the word to let Darren know he saw him. What a bright little boy. Darren then noticed that one of the Russians had the talit and tefillin bags in one of his hands. They must have figured out the same thing he had, and perhaps had even grilled the repairer. Darren also realized it must have been obvious to the Russians that they were trapped, but he knew they weren't going to give up the bags at this point, and they were certainly capable of shooting the family. He had practically no time left to act. In all his years of service, Darren had never killed a man, or a woman for that matter, and it was his intention and goal to leave the force with that record. However, he realized now that such a goal would be impossible. In fact, like Gary Cooper in High Noon or Alan Ladd in Shane, he knew he was going to have to kill all three men. He waited for the safest moment, that is, safest for the Mendel family. One thing he settled in his heart is that he had to do it, not just for Chaya and her children, but for all the victims of the Holocaust who were slaughtered like cattle, including the family who had hidden the diamonds. He waited until the Russian with the bag glanced at it. Now! He aimed for heads and started with the undistracted one. He had been at the top of his class in target practice, with 100% bullseyes, and that came in handy now. He pulled the trigger, and the window glass shattered. The Russian's head was propelled forward before he collapsed. Then he quickly shot the one with the bags. The window was opened, and the Russian's head exploded like a shattered egg. He didn't have time to watch the blood and brain matter spew from its open top. Finally, he turned to the third man, who was in shock. He regained his faculties and swung his gun toward Darren. At least the family was safe. Now it was a duel, and Darren had the better of him. He squeezed the trigger and shot him in the face, caving his nose into his brain. He, like the others, collapsed to the floor. The children were all screaming and ran into their mother's arms. Natan, however, ran toward Darren and the shattered glass window. Darren dropped his gun into the bushes below and held out his arms to stop Natan while screaming, "Stop, Natan!" Natan obeyed, but Darren lost his balance and fell backwards off the ledge and down the one story to a combination of bushes and pavement. When he hit the ground, his ankles snapped. Before he fainted, he shouted as loud as he could, "I got all three. They're all dead. The family's safe. Help me, and bring those velvet bags to the lab." When he woke up several hours later at none other than the Maimonides Medical Center emergency room, Percocet was being pumped through his veins. Naomi was telling him how proud of him she was, how he was her hero, as well as Natan's, and how there was one large diamond inside each lead-lined tefillin box. A rabbi had even observed that operation, although such was not the case with his ankle surgery, she added with a smile. He didn't remember any of that later, or her gentle kiss. Chapter 51. The Third Winter. The fall passed slowly for Darren Brock. Both of his ankles were cast. The damage to one of the more complex bone structures in the human body ended up being considerable. After a week or so, he refused Percocet and other opioids, so he was left with Tylenol, Advil, and earnest prayer. The winter made an untimely New York entrance on Thanksgiving, depositing 5 inches of powdery, slippery snow that made it challenging for Darren to go out. Although the snow melted 2 days later, the temperatures were well below freezing by the first night of Hanukkah in mid-December, and there were large patches of ice on sidewalks and any uncleared walkways in front of Brooklyn brownstones like the one where the Kaplans were hosting a party, as they had the year before. The streets, however, were mostly clear. Darren wished it was already spring, and he could walk down the aisle with Naomi at his just-planned Beth Yeshua wedding. He sat in an armchair in the Kaplan living room with his crutches at his side. Naomi was at the kitchen table, polishing the old Kiev menorah that had been in the family since the 1800s. Darren could see the kitchen light reflect on her diamond engagement ring, one that was a lot smaller than Mandy Mendel's hidden treasure, but bigger than the ring he had given Margaret. That seemed so long ago, although it wasn't. It felt like he had stepped out of a fog since then, and not only that, he seemed to have truly grown up At 49 years old, as ridiculous as that may seem, he realized that, as much as he was deeply in love with Naomi the year before, he was more prepared now to be the caring, emotionally intimate husband God had called him to be, and he was more circumspect in his life. It's funny how killing 3 men can do that to a man, he mused. Mark Silver was sitting on the couch reading a newspaper. He looked up to see his father-in-law, David Kaplan, and his wife, Lisa, come down the stairs with their children. David was holding his Santa hat. I was showing them what I do on Christmas, visiting the children in the cancer ward. I was explaining what a mitzvah is. That's why Lindsay will have what is called a bat mitzvah, and Noah's is called a bar mitzvah. How many Jewish children understand that? They understand. Maybe they'll come with me to the Maimonides Medical Center Children's Ward this year. Noah felt compelled to say something. Grandpa says they're the other. That means they're not like us, but we should treat them like we treat us, right, Grandpa? He coughed nervously. Naomi's polishing skipped a beat. Then he answered Noah. Yes, you understand, Noah. Just then, the guests started to arrive. Aunt Ida came practically arm in arm with Mahalia Morse and was as gregarious as usual. Look who I brought. A perfect copy of me and my new best friend. I haven't had a best friend since my old pal Zelda died 10 years ago. I've just been stuck with all of you who call me Aunt Ida. Mahalia reciprocated. Yes, amen. You all know God works in those mysterious ways of his, well, you all know the line. Wonders to perform. I met this twin sister while visiting Naomi in the hospital. We talked about... Naomi stopped polishing and interrupted. I know. Both of you talked about what a fool I was to have rejected Darren. I heard the whole thing. I heard everything. In the dark and in the light. The light, too. She glanced at her father. Mahalia jumped in. I knew you were listening. The Spirit told me that. I'm glad you took our advice. I did. Shortly thereafter, I heard you too, Abba, when you talked about legacy and the letter and everything. I heard you weep and felt you kiss my forehead. I love you so much, Abba, so much. I love everyone who visited me, everyone. David Kaplan smiled as his eyes twinkled. Remember, Naomi, I will always love you, regardless. I told you that, regardless. Thank you, Abba, she responded from across the room. Thank you. She knew that, for now, she couldn't expect more than that. After that, the door flung open, and in came Marvin, accompanied by a plump, round-faced woman in her early 50s. She was a few inches taller than Marvin, with a Hasidic silver shido wig and a long, black, bulging, button-down dress beneath her open black wool coat. Marvin wasn't about to introduce her, so she introduced herself. I'm Leah, and I suppose you all know my future husband, Marvin? Naomi, who had been holding a knife, dropped it on the table. Leah continued, We met at synagogue. He looked up at the balcony, and there I was. He just kept staring. I couldn't wait for the service to end. Of course, we had to meet his mother, and that was it. There was silence for a few seconds, after which Mahalia shouted in Pentecostal style, Now that's what I'm talking about. Ida added, Amen. It's about time. And then everyone clapped and congratulated them. Leah waited for the applause to stop. May I ask where the restroom is? When that was explained and she left the room, Marvin stepped up to Naomi and spoke just above a whisper, which wasn't easy for him. God wanted this Jacob to have his Rachel, I mean you, but I had to settle for Leah. At least she's from very Orthodox, unlike your future husband. Naomi whispered back. The anger in her voice was palpable. How dare you, Marvin? Don't you ever say that again. I mean, you're marrying that Christian Darren, aren't you? That's not what I meant. You'll hurt her if you ever talk like that and she hears it. Never, never, never call her second best or treat her as second best, ever. Do you hear me? Marvin, do you hear me? He was taken aback. He had never seen Naomi so angry, except that one time at Macy's. But she was even angrier now. Marvin, tell me you will love her and cherish her as your first choice. Tell me that now, or I'll tell her you don't deserve her and not to marry you. Now! He fumbled with the orange sock hat in his hand, and then he spoke up. My mother told me the same thing. Well, she's right. Naomi walked across the room just as the door opened again. Abrahet came in with Jeremy, Joshua, and Javier. Jeremy and Joshua ran over to Darren, who was sitting in the armchair with his crutches leaning at its side. The older, taller Jeremy looked at his casted feet. You really did it this time. The younger, rounder Joshua added, You did. We really miss you. But we're really glad you dumped that Margaret and you're back with Naomi. We're so excited. Jeremy shook his head. Don't say dump, Joshua. It isn't nice. But he did. Darren reached his hands out and took both their hands. Well, boys, I did essentially dump her, but she's got a new love already, and I have the love of my life, so all's well, as they say. You are both growing so fast. Not me, chubbier, shorter Joshua said. Yes, you, Joshua. I can see it starting. You'll be as tall as your brother when it's over, maybe taller. Javier had already run over and pulled Naomi down from a standing position to hug her. She was at a loss. She looked at Mahalia, who mouthed, His heart has softened a lot since the attack. Naomi mouthed back, I can see that. He snuggled against her and said, I love you. I love you so much. I'm so happy for you and Darren, and you're all better. Thank you. Thank you for saving me. They both began to cry. He refused to let her go. Finally, after she got on her knees and hugged him tightly, he smiled and walked off to play with the other children. When Chaya and her children came, Natan climbed onto Darren's lap and stayed there for the rest of the night, falling asleep, nestling his angelic face with cherubic side curls against Darren's shoulder. The final guests were Rabbi Sheldon Goldberg and his wife Jody, and Stanley, who proceeded to spend much of his time reminiscing with David Kaplan about their late friend Mahmoud. Jody Goldberg gave Naomi the longest hug of the night. My precious Naomi, engaged! I knew it would work out. I told you, remember? You did. Oh, Jody, I hadn't felt a mother's kind of love for years until I wept in your arms in Deborah's room. Please forgive me for all the unkindness. Oh, Naomi, I understand what you were feeling, but look at you, a blushing bride at Darren's side. I'm so happy for you, and my husband is officiating. So exciting. Get ready for me to fuss over you, including finding a dress and paying for it. They both cried and hugged again, and then everyone ate. When they had had their fill of sufganiyot, Hanukkah donuts, and of potato latkes, Naomi lit the candles for the first night. They all sang the two familiar Hanukkah blessings that are chanted every night, and the special first night Shehechianu, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'hegianu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given us life, sustained us, and enabled us to reach this season. As Naomi watched the flames of the servant candle and the first night candle flicker, she considered those words about enabling us to reach this season, as well as the written words of the greatest Jew that ever lived, well, the second greatest Jew, her beloved father. In God's wisdom and God's way, you will carry the legacy of our forefathers into the future. She repeated those words to herself and then spoke her own words deep down in her heart, right then and there, on the first night of the Feast of Dedication, on Hanukkah. If the saving, caring God who put such love for Israel in Darren's heart is also my God, and my God is also the God of Israel, the God my father believes in, then I can carry on the legacy. I must carry it on, and I will carry it on. She looked over and saw Natan sleeping in Darren's lap. Somehow, her father's legacy was evident even there. The end of the Linotype Legacy. The prequel, The Linotype Operator, is available at Amazon Audible.